As humans, we are naturally inclined to explore and understand the world we live in, whether by venturing into uncharted territories, places long forgotten, or even the expanse of space. All of it is to better understand our world and our existence. But what if we do eventually get the answers that we're looking for? And what if those answers uncover vast, horrifying atrocities that prove just how small we are in comparison to the things that lie beyond the veil and within the depths of the cosmos? Hey, I'm Hound, and on this episode of Werewolf Guy Talks to You long-windedly about not werewolf films, we will be going over a ton of films that either depict, discuss, or employ cosmic horrors. If you spend even a little bit of time within the horror genre, you've most likely seen more zombies and possessions than you could care to remember. The cosmic horror subgenre kind of reminds us that there's more to horror than just monsters and ghosts, and that sometimes it's the absence of those things that can truly be terrifying. It's a very unique genre, as cosmic horror has many different faces, from films with no direct antagonistic force in sight, to films filled with gory grotesqueries, and everything in between, covering pretty much every big genre out there, even romance. So, as is usual, before we start discussing the many different types of films that you can get when you sprinkle just a little bit of that Lovecraftian influence into their DNA, let's first go over what is cosmic horror. Cosmic horror really, at the end of the day, is not like the other genres. It can have gore and action and all that stuff, but cosmic and Lovecraftian horrors explicitly deal with the psychological and the philosophical side of horror. Unlike creature features or slasher films that have mostly natural or human antagonists that are tangible and conquerable, the antagonistic forces inside of cosmic works typically are intangible, and the humanity versus eldritch matchup doesn't look so good. Cosmic horror is also a very broad genre, fitting very well within gory body horror as well as slow and thoughtful thrillers. So when attempting to determine what is and isn't, what are some of the core principles of cosmic horror? This is an image called Hubble Legacy Field, taken over the course of 16 years with the image containing light that existed over 13 billion years ago. This image has approximately 265,000 galaxies within it. Galaxies. For scale, our galaxy, the Milky Way, is estimated to contain 100 billion planets, and is about 100,000 light years across. We, being relatively at the center, would need at least 40,000 light years to exit it horizontally, and the nearest galaxy to us, the Canis Major Dwarf Galaxy, is only about 25,000 light years away, which would only take 750 billion years of travel to get to. And as far as time goes, the Milky Way is about 13.6 billion years old, Earth is about 4.5 billion years old, the dinosaurs got murked about 66 million years ago, Australopithecus was 4 million years ago, the Odyssey was written 2,800 years ago, and the first film, the Roundhay Gardens scene, was made 116 years ago. 265,000 galaxies. Getting back on track, this is the very root of cosmic horror, that holy shit, we have not been here long, and all of our accomplishments as a species, no matter how great, ultimately seem meaningless in the face of the great expanse of the world that we just so happen to live in. Whether it's the revelation of a giant uncaring entity that could smite us by complete accident, the uncovering of a world more vast than previously thought, or secret going-ons that our human minds cannot comprehend. Nearly every facet of Lovecraftian horrors stems from this one core principle: existentiality, that we don't truly understand much of anything, that we as a species are utterly inconsequential, and that nothing we ever do will really last or matter. So, we've greatly covered the existential foundation and how crucial it is to cosmic horror. But what about the other conventions of the genre? First up is forbidden knowledge. Whether being the truth of the universe, possibly the main character's lineage, or the existence of entities much older than us, all lying just beyond our understanding, cosmic stories usually hinge on the piecing together of forbidden and hidden knowledge, sometimes using technological or scientific advancements to break down that barrier. This is commonly followed by madness, that after attaining such knowledge, seeing beyond reality and witnessing sights unimaginable, someone can't hold on to their grasp of sanity. Like the allegory in the cave, you can't ever really return to ignorance. Next are uncaring horrors. Completely unsympathetic and uncaring entities or realities that do not abide by any idea of morals or understandable motivations, the antagonists of cosmic and Lovecraftian horror aren't really there to counter the protagonist and are less a villain and more a domineering and indomitable force. Then we have some culty stuff, usually involving secret societies or underground organizations, whether worshipping an eldritch entity or attempting to bring a hidden plan to fruition, that operate in the shadows under the veil of moonlight, that harbor far grander plans than conceivable by mere humans. And finally, pairing hand in hand with the existentiality of cosmic horror is the alienation and isolation of our characters, either positioned against the unearthed cults that are now outnumbering the protagonist, or because the forbidden knowledge they attained must be carried alone. Sometimes they employ body swapping, someone you know being taken over and no longer being that person, or even yourself being taken over, and experiencing alienation from your own body, and maybe even your own mind. These are, as simply as I can make them, the main tells of a cosmic or Lovecraftian story. The existentiality, the characters feeling isolated, the uncovering of forbidden knowledge, and all in the face of an indifferent antagonistic force. And sometimes some culty stuff. Cosmic horror is so fascinating to me, because these principles, as well as being storytelling gold in my opinion, fear of the unknown being a great driving force for horror, and mysteries slowly unveiled over time leading to engaging stories, for example, are also so flexible, allowing filmmakers to just go wherever their minds can take them. Where other genres have relatively limiting conventions, filling in a good bit of the blanks for you when writing a story, I find that the ones for cosmic horror are kind of freeing in comparison, that it tells you in a general sense where you can start, but not where it has to end, allowing the genre to be one of the most diverse I've ever had the pleasure of exploring, and it really is something special. Also, I'll be sort of using cosmic and Lovecraftian interchangeably throughout this video, but basically cosmic is more centered on the cosmos and existentialism, while Lovecraftian is usually involving those things, but with more to do with genealogy and cults. Just thought I'd clear that up real quick. Cosmic horror owes its existence to H.P. Lovecraft. It was the result of a mishmash of science fiction and gothic horror infused with Lovecraft's own fascinations, and most of all, his fears. Growing up, he would spend a lot of time in his grandfather's library where he would foster a connection with gothic fiction, science, anthropology, and astronomy. Lovecraft would eventually become a staunch atheist, no doubt having an effect on his ideals on the answers to life, and how nothing really matters at that large of a scale, leading to such an existential and cynical viewpoint present in his writings. And given his parents both succumbing to mental illness in asylums, this would similarly affect his views on fate and destiny, with it being primarily influenced by bloodlines and genetics in his stories. Lovecraft was also writing during a time of great technological and scientific advancements, a time when these advancements were quickly expanding our understanding of the world, just how long we've been here, just how big the universe is, and how small we are within it. And many people were asking the question, should we be doing this? Just as well, he was paradoxically fascinated by the expanses of the world, the different civilizations and their unique cultures. But it was also their differences that frightened him. Funnily enough, the scientific term for fear of the unknown is actually xenophobia. The more you know. I went more in depth about this in the previous video, but I do want to say that I think it's because of these views that his specific brand of horror became so widespread and popular. The xenophobia, for the most part, when it was pushed onto aliens and creatures rather than explicitly humans, was what made his stories able to acutely and thoroughly convey such a sense of being othered. At the core, they were about outsiders in a very alienating world, and that makes them immensely relatable to a large and diverse group of people. Specifically, ironically, the same minorities that Lovecraft didn't particularly like. Lovecraftian horror, and by extension cosmic horror, is a very unique genre of horror that allows itself to be transplanted into a number of stories. But as discussed in the previous video, there are a ton of issues when it comes to directly adapting the works of H.P. Lovecraft into films. They try to be more like movies and end up turning the antagonist into tangible and beatable creations, or they just implement a ton of unnecessary action. They suffer from adapting a written work that can expertly play off of readers' imaginations and forcing it into a very objective medium such as film. And finally, it's also kind of hard to be unknown and unknowable. When I say the word Cthulhu, and you instantly know what I'm talking about. Where I think cosmic and Lovecraftian horror can truly excel is not by adapting the works of Lovecraft, but instead using just a drip of the cosmic into an original story. So, before we delve into all the films that I have lined up, let's take a look at some of the other areas of media that we can see Lovecraftian inspiration. Lovecraftian and cosmic horrors exist in far vaster realms than just the feature films that we will be discussing today. Lovecraft's influence and contribution to weird fiction can be felt through the new weird genre writers, many of which have more positive readings of existentiality that is specifically interesting to me. And not to mention that Lovecraft's expansive and inclusive attitude towards what would be known as the Cthulhu mythos has allowed a lot of modern great writers to pitch into the expanded mythos, such as Stephen King. There are also some extremely popular and beloved board games and tabletop RPGs that we can owe their existence to Lovecraft. I'm not big into board games, despite having an 85% win rate in Catan, but I do admit that the thought of trying out Call of Cthulhu, although daunting, seems very fun if you can find the right group of people. And of course, we can't forget the entirety of the subreddit, I'm Sorry John, which spiraled from a single webcomic into an endless plethora of Lovecraftian, Garfieldian entities, each grotesque being unfathomable and mind-shattering in their own way. My girlfriend also informed me that the Fallout franchise has a few bits of Lovecraft in them as well, with a character named Pikmin,
but I'll collect my own again soon,
and a location named Dunwich, so there's that. You can even find Lovecraft's influence in music, like with Metallica's Call of Cthulhu, The Thing That Should Not Be, and All Nightmare Long. But it's not just them, as many great metal bands have all made songs referencing, based on, or just inspired by the works of Lovecraft. Shout out Necrogoblicon, by the way. There's even Lovecraft-themed bands like the Darkest of the Hillside Thickets. I love how a lot of metal bands are just like, fuck yeah, Lovecraft-esque. There's also a lot of TV shows that feature Lovecraftian inspiration, from Twin Peaks with the portal to the Black Lodge and the importance of dreams, to something more modern with Stranger Things with the concept of another world opposite our own, and the lab looking for ways to utilize or understand it, unleashing sort of uncaring monsters. Supernatural, a show I used to like a lot, has a few Lovecraftian episodes, and Phillips himself pops up in one of them. Doctor Who apparently has a bunch of episodes, but sadly, I don't speak British, so I'll just leave a link in the description for someone who does. And of course, there's a TV show based off of a book, based off of Lovecraft's work, called Lovecraft Country. I don't watch TV shows that get cancelled. Sorry. But a very prominent one in Lovecraftian discussions is True Detective, mainly due to its inclusion of in-universe references to Chambers' The King in Yellow, which exists as a part of the Cthulhu mythos. While it's not as overtly Lovecraftian as some other things, it's still a great show that I recommend to pretty much anybody. The first season is, at least. I haven't watched beyond that yet. It's got a good bit of culty stuff going on, a feeling of looming threats just out of plain sight, and an unraveling enigma at the center of the plot that brings with it a strong sense of insignificance. It's a damn good show. Of course, as we mentioned, there's also anthologies like Night Gallery, The Outer Limits, and Twilight Zone, and apparently a few X-Files plots as well, all feature Lovecraftian premises for some of their entries. A bunch of the Love, Death, and Robots episodes also fit the bill, and really make use of their shorter than normal format, as well as their ability to experiment with animation to translate Lovecraftian horror pretty well at some points. Speaking of anthology TV shows, if there's some good Lovecraftian episodes that you like, leave a comment. I'd love to check some more out, especially if there's some from Tales from the Crypt, although I kind of doubt that would have any. I really need to get around to rewatching that. Speaking of Tales from the Crypt, there's also quite a few children's TV shows featuring a lot of Lovecraftian inspiration, or just nods. The Real Ghostbusters, Grim Adventures of Billy and Mandy, and Scooby-Doo Mystery Incorporated, to name a few.
By the tendrils of Shupshap Sumagorath, you frightened me.
There's even Yu-Gi-Oh! Archetypes inspired by Lovecraft, called the Elder Entities, one of which is Elder Entity Norton, who is still on the ban list. As you can see, Lovecraft's influence reaches further than the written form, and exists in practically every medium today, and as a solidified part of pop culture. But there are 3 pieces of non-feature film media that I'd like to quickly go over, despite them not being in my normal range. Now, I don't really play a lot of games. If I can't flex my mediocre aim on someone less skilled than myself...
Beast. Beast.
Shots at you? Oh, what the... Oh my god! Or commit war crimes to some lo-fi music and build large intricate farms that I'll forget where I put them, then I don't want to play it. A lot of games inspired by or adapting Lovecraft's work are similarly inspired by the tabletop game Call of Cthulhu, and fall into the categorization of RPG games. I am not a big fan of RPGs, so many apologies, as I'm not going to be discussing such games as Dredge, The Sinking City, or Cultist Simulator. I will leave a link in the description for some videos on Lovecraftian games though, if you're interested. However, there is one game that I have played that is explicitly Lovecraftian. Bloodborne, which is neither an aim-oriented or chill game unless you count going AFK and taking in the beautiful level design as chill gameplay, which is valid. So what even drew me into it, you may ask? Well, I got interested in playing Bloodborne despite my aversion to Souls games and similar RPGs because of the atmosphere of it. I just really love the use of Gothic architecture and the Victorian setting mixed with horror. And yes, it has werewolves in it. But Bloodborne has some pretty deep lore to it that is a whole lot more interesting to me than the gameplay. You can play the whole game with only barely picking up on what's really happening, and that's kind of exactly how I played it. Max strength and dexterity, Ludwig's Holy Blade, purposefully overlevel like it's Pokemon, and then game becomes a hack and slash. But if you stop the button mashing through bosses like they're shittily crafted Lego dioramas of the brick walls they're intended to be, and actually pay attention, the more you realize, hey, this is a lot like Lovecraft. The very first thing you do in the game, after all, is throw away your humanity. And then the second thing you do in the game is get your shit rocked by your werewolf doctor. But there's so much to Bloodborne that screams Lovecraft. The importance of blood, people turning into hybrid creatures, cosmic beings coming down to pick a fight with humanity, insanity, obligatory fuck Mikolash, cultish activities and secret societies, the amygdalas that reveal themselves the lower your sanity goes, great old ones, scientists fucking around and playing God, unintentionally, unleashing powerful beings from realms incomprehensible, strides in understanding the old ones and what the blood is capable of. The more you learn, the lower your sanity dips. Losing your humanity makes you stronger and more capable of taking on the cosmic, eldritch entities serving as bosses. The different groups of Yharnam attempting to get closer to the gods in their various ways, and as it turns out, they're not really gods. They're just being mistaken as gods as humans try and fail to understand these otherworldly visitors. Fuck. Apparently, Bloodborne even has its own Innsmouth area in the DLC I haven't played called the Fishing Hamlet, which is funny because while reading The Shadow over Innsmouth, and specifically the rambling of Lovecraft over the architecture of the town, I couldn't help but imagine the weird winding roads and alleys of Yharnam. One of my core memories surrounding this game is I had my favorite Gojira album, From Mars to Sirius, on repeat while I played through Bloodborne for the first time, and it's one of my favorite memories as global warming plays and I stumble into a horde of celestial emissaries. It just fits so well, and they're just now forever linked. By the way, you might notice the credits and whatnot for the footage that I'm using. I played this for free during a small window where I had PlayStation Plus, and I enjoyed the game a lot. I wanted to buy it, but I said, nah, I'll just wait for it to come out on PC. Still waiting, but yeah, Bloodborne is super Lovecraftian, and I'm really glad that tons of people enjoy it for that aspect, because it's definitely my favorite part. Besides the werewolves.
Oh my fucking Christ!
When looking for Lovecraft in manga, the main name that you'll be hearing is Go Tanabe, who has adapted tons of H.P. Lovecraft stories in manga form, with absolutely gorgeous and painstakingly detailed panels, clearly showing love and care for the individual stories. However, most likely the next big name that you'll be hearing is Junji Ito, whose work is very inspired by Lovecraft. He's even done a portrait of H.P. Lovecraft as well as a painting inspired by The Color Out of Space. Which, yep, that's his handiwork for damn sure. And although a lot of Ito's work is Lovecraftian, even my favorite of his, The Enigma of Amigara Faults, which includes a bit of cosmic horror with the inescapable and hypnotic allure of the holes that suddenly appeared on the face of a mountain after an earthquake. It would be a shame not to showcase his most acclaimed manga, Uzumaki, which is a fascinating story that gets more Lovecraftian the more you read. The manga itself is from the perspective of a girl whose hometown is slowly encaptured by an obsession. It starts off small, her soon-to-be boyfriend's dad collecting things with spirals, and then it moves to larger and more cosmically implicative happenings that make you go, what the fuck am I reading? If you're going to read Uzumaki or any other of Ito's work, I strongly urge you to read it in the physical form if you can, as Ito is revered as a master of the page turn. He builds up anticipation, and when you turn the page, you get blasted with an onslaught of grotesque panels and shocking discoveries, and that's something that I really want people to experience. Uzumaki has a live-action feature film adaptation that, spoilers, we will be talking about a bit later. But, depending on when this video comes out, the long-awaited anime adaptation of the manga should be releasing on the 28th of September. I'm stoked, as after finally getting around to reading the manga, the film itself didn't nearly go in depth enough, so I can't wait to see the rest of the story adapted to the screen. Actually, as of recording, the first episode has come out and people are enjoying it. I'm waiting for the rest of them to come out because that's how I roll. But people are really liking it, and I'm just getting more and more hyped up for it. I really hope I don't get let down. It is now February 26th of 2025, and needless to say, I am a tad bit more trepidatious. Anyways, speaking of anime, when it comes to anime, despite being a huge fan of it as a medium, I've really only seen a ton of basic stuff. The least popular thing I've listed on my anime list is Mars of Destruction, and that's because I watched it as a joke with my partner. So, if it isn't a super popular or frequently recommended anime, or anything from Satoshi Kon or Ghibli, then I probably haven't seen it. Therefore, I feel like my opinions and experience in this area of filmmaking are a bit subpar. Imposter syndrome is a bitch. Nevertheless, there are quite a few that people tend to list when talking about Lovecraft in anime. Berserk, for example, once you get to a certain point in the story, obligatory fuck Griffith. Neon Genesis Evangelion, despite its blatant Judeo-Christian iconography and symbolism, is very Lovecraftian when you start to peel all that stuff back. Made in Abyss has a giant mysterious hole that we still don't know what could possibly be awaiting at the bottom. Demon Bane, the only one here that I haven't seen personally, is apparently a mecha anime with tons of Lovecraft nods and inspiration. I actually just finished a rewatch of Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood, and funnily enough, it was way more Lovecraftian than I thought it would be. The main character's pursuit of the truth, represented as a void with a giant rectangular gate, the eye imagery and tentacles of course, the antagonist's goal being to swallow what he refers to as a god that has existed as long or longer than the planet has. Not to mention, there's a specific line spoken by Father.
When you notice an insect on the ground, do you stop to consider it a fool?
Which, while mostly just a line that makes him think he's a badass, is actually pretty in line with the utter indifference of the so-called gods of Lovecraft. There's also Hayore Naruko-san, which is a bit contentious. It is a parody harem anime that features a normal human guy having a weird love triangle, square, dodecahedron with several old ones and outer gods from the Cthulhu mythos who have taken on the appearance of schoolgirls and fight night gaunts in order to protect Earth. Honestly, it wasn't as bad as it sounds, and yes, I did watch it just for this video. There is also Naked Peak, Climb the Mountains of Madness, which is a proof of concept trailer for what will hopefully become an animated film adaptation of At the Mountains of Madness. So long as the studio isn't kidnapped, acquired by MAPPA to work on animating Sukuna's stomach mouth for 12 hours a day. But the one I want to discuss is a bit out of left field, and that is Digimon Tamers. This is my favorite season of Digimon, and it kind of always has been. While the series is no stranger to deeper themes, I always like to point to the dynamic between Matt and TK in the first season, both now children of divorce, and how Matt feels an overwhelming sense of responsibility when it comes to TK. But in Tamers, it's much more mature, and admittedly, edgy, with a lot more focus on interpersonal relationships and specifically mental health. And although Gabumon is objectively the best rookie Digimon in the entirety of the series, Tamers has the second best Digimon, Guilmon, who's actually voiced by Steve Bloom. Spike and Sub-Zero voices a dinosaur.
Takato-man.
What more could you want? Oh, a Digimon on a motorcycle, you say? Would you believe me if I said this was one of the series' most well-developed and nuanced characters? The reason this series is cosmic is because it was written by Chiaki J. Konaka, who we talked about earlier with his adaptation of Shadow over Innsmouth. Like with most of Konaka's work, there are tons of references to H.P. Lovecraft's work and mythos, something that makes more sense after reading this quote from him. Konaka would put a ton of Lovecraft into the DNA of his work, like Serial Experiments Lane, him being the sole reason we even have Dagomon and Digimon, and Tamers is no different. After witnessing the death of her partner Digimon, local jobber Leomon, I mean, you're gonna have to learn to expect that sort of thing. It's Leomon. Jerry mentally snaps. Jerry spent the whole series seeing her friends with their partner Digimon, and now that she finally found hers, she lost him. This, combined with the loss of her mother and inability to connect with her new stepmom, she feels like no one really knows who she is, and feels like her true destiny in a show about children discovering their destiny in life is to be alone. The depression overtakes her, and this results in the release of the D-Reaper in the real world, a virus that serves as our indifferent antagonist, merely executing its protocol to delete anything that has evolved past its set parameters. The sense of alienation, the morally gray villain, even some of the Digimon it summoned look like they would fit in a Lovecraft story. The imagery here is pretty fucking wild for a kids' TV show based on a Tamagotchi clone. But, of course, at the end of the day, the power of love breaks the D-Reaper's hold on Jerry, and the world is saved, with the caveat that the main character's Digimon have to return now. Why is this always so fucking sad? So that about does it for Lovecraft and the other mediums that I'm not used to talking about. We've covered games, manga, and anime. Now we can finally move on to films. I don't have my clicker. But when talking about how universal this specific brand of horror can be, ranging from kids' TV shows to music, and genres from science fiction to extreme horror, and all the different stops made along the way, how do you go about organizing a list of these films? I am legitimately asking you, please help. One of the biggest hurdles for this video was the organization. Just how do you categorize these films into bite-sized portions? Should I do it by subgenres or themes? Which ones were more cosmic, more Lovecraftian? This one has cults, but this one has fish people. This one has both of them, this one has none. It all gets super muddy. What I inevitably settled on is a cop-out. So what we'll be doing is, first, we will be going over the found footage films as their own category, followed by a 3-tier structure that will see the films getting progressively more in line with the horror genre, and building up to more extreme horror towards the end. And finally, I have selected an entirely superfluous clickbaity top 10 list that is just filled with movies that I enjoyed a lot that I want to talk about a bit more. And it also works as a nice closer for the video. So, let's begin. Due to the polarity of found footage films, I decided to give them their own little portion that you can skip if they're not your gig, although I would strongly suggest at least sticking around for the final entry on this list, so I will leave a chapter marker there. And for more discussion on found footage, I actually have a video about that. There are quite a few found footage films that qualify as Lovecraftian. Given HP's tendency to include epistolary devices, which of course I love, absolutely found footage and Lovecraft would be a match made in heaven for some, but also the commonality of low budgets and quick shoots present in found footage results in a lot of writers trending towards not showing their antagonists, instead leaving it up to the viewer's imagination. While this is typically done with ghost stories, it can also benefit Lovecraftian ones. Case in point, the accidental implementation of this in Blair Witch Project, which on the Lovecraft wiki is listed as a Lovecraftian film. I kinda disagree, but hey, I'm not gonna say no to talking about this film more, so let's roll with it. In Blair Witch Project, after venturing into the forest past a certain point, the trio of protagonists get their asses lost. And it doesn't help that Michael, microphone for short, tossed the map into the water. Each night they encounter progressively worse events, until finally stumbling upon a house while trying to find their missing friend, Josh. The mysterious nature of their nightly antagonist, and one could even argue the winding reality of the forest, if you believe Heather to actually be good with the map, works very effectively alongside the found footage format, and does lend some Lovecraft flair to the film that would be expanded on a bit with the sequel. No, not the good one, the bad sequel. Continuing with our discussion of found footage meets The Love Man, the Cloverfield trilogy is a series of films that seems to get brought up a ton, so I'm going to quickly go over them before digging into the meat and potatoes of this section. In Cloverfield, a bunch of people get together to throw their friend a farewell party before the events of the night are cataclysmically thrown off course when a giant unknown creature emerges from the waters off the coast of New York and begins wreaking havoc indiscriminately. The downside when connecting this with Lovecraftian horror is that it is more of a monster invasion kaiju film. You have to be aware of the ARG that occurred prior to this film's release, as well as the full franchise as a whole, to get the full breadth of the cosmic influence on the story, which is basically oil rig in the ocean as a front for a secret government organization harvesting resources from an ancient creature and all that jazz. Nevertheless, Cloverfield does a good job of putting us in the shoes of common people, not you TJ Miller, during a possibly world-ending event as an indifferent alien creature just fucks shit up. I've grown to like it more over the years, basically. The sequel, 10 Cloverfield Lane, is less so Lovecraftian, instead centering on a lone apocalypse bunker and its inhabitants, serving as one of the better psychological minimalistic horror films out there, in my opinion. And also, this just makes it a good movie, until it gives us the answers at the end that are also given to us by being named 10 Cloverfield Lane, and we know there's giant monsters outside. It's not a spoiler if the title spoils it, damn it. You should have called it 10 Shepherd Lane because of the particle accelerator and paradox, but also Goodman's claims to be saving them from damnation, or at least name it something that doesn't ruin the fucking reveal. But that's about all the time that I have for this episode of The Film Could Have Been a Lot Better with one relatively minor change in post. The final entry, Cloverfield Paradox, is, within the film itself, the most cosmic of the bunch, but it's also the most hated of them. I enjoyed it for what it was. I'm a huge fan of Daniel Bruhl, and I also went in with gutter-level expectations for the franchise at this point, given J.J. Abrams' Abramsness, and knowing that the qualities I liked so much about Cloverfield Lane were not likely to return. I went in expecting trash, and it wasn't completely trash, so it was a good watch. Funny how that works. In the Cloverfield Paradox, when we're not being beaten with conventions, it delivers more Lovecraft than in the previous films. Space and time shifts, body horror, mutations, parallel universes accessed with the help of a scientific machine. It's absolutely Lovecraftian. It's just not that good of a film. So now that my Cloverfield franchise rant is done, let's talk about some movies. Starting off with my honorable mentions for the found footage portion. Cryptic Plasm is a film that takes an interesting premise of following one of those TV show hosts who goes and researches several different types of things, like creature sightings, strange occurrences, possible aliens, and whatnot, except this time, all that shit is real. What was intended to be a web series gets fleshed out and compiled into a feature-length film that quickly turns towards the cosmic with a operatic finish of blood and guts. The web series idea is something I hope the director returns to, as a short episode format ripping on Monster Quest, resulting in the host's death each installment, would both be funny and allow for a lot of creativity. Another honorable mention for local North Georgian filmmaker Clayton Thompson's feature debut, The Nothing, which is a story about a college graduate who's lost in life and depressed over not having accomplished much, who sets out to isolate himself deep in the North Georgia mountains in order to force himself to finally finish writing his story. Have fun, guy! Mostly inspired by Blair Witch, the inclusion of cultish activities brings this a bit closer towards Lovecraft territory. While there are notable issues with the polish, such as how the first act of the film takes up way too much time, almost half of it actually, the spotty acting in the beginning, and the overall lack of momentum through the remainder of the film, I still enjoyed it for what it was, while obviously being extremely lenient on it for being both a found footage film and also filmed in my neck of the woods. I hope he continues making films though, because I'm interested. The final honorable mention, and then I swear we'll get the ball rolling, is The Outwaters. The Outwaters focuses on a group of friends setting out to film a music video in the desert when things go very, very bad. This film is less story and more focused on being an experimental experiential film that is absolutely not for everybody. As the nightmare unfolds for our main characters, several elements of Lovecraft start popping up. Insignificance, as the humans are just along for the ride as all these horrific things are happening with no way to stop them or get out. Time and space warping and strange entities. This film just gets straight up wild towards the end. Truth be told, I kind of didn't like it the first time that I saw it, in part due to the fact that I had been looking forward to it for over a year in hopes that we would get a found footage revival. So my expectations were a bit too high. But when doing the research for this video, I sat down and gave it the time of day again, and actually quite enjoyed it. Knowing going in where the faults were, I just tuned out the majority of the first half and then sat back and experienced the second half of the film. And I think that's the intended way of watching it. Also shout out to Robbie Banfitch, both director and main actor, camera operator, writer, and editor. The dude wore all the hats on the production, and I hope he's proud of the film, as it is very evident that he cares a lot about it. Moving on to the found footage cosmic horror films that I can easily recommend, let's take a moment to shout out the frequency of Lovecraftian segments in the anthology series VHS. VHS 2 has 2 segments, Clinical Trials that's a bit from Beyond-y, and Safe Haven that's culty but with mostly demon stuff. VHS Viral, the one that doesn't exist, features a segment from Nacho Vigalondo that has an alternate world with, again, a more Judeo-Christian demonic religion that dominates. Still wouldn't recommend watching Viral though. VHS 99 has To Hell and Back, which is a very fun portal-hopping hellscape short. VHS 85 has a wraparound narrative of a shape-shifting entity, and also the segment No Wake, that involves a resurrecting lake. While only a couple stick out as directly Lovecraftian, I enjoy seeing these type of shorts that border the line and take inspiration in their own ways. I'm also just a huge fan of VHS for being an easy-to-put-on anthology series that we get every year now. Now, getting into the feature films, I feel like I have to put Banshee Chapter first. A journalist, determined to get to the bottom of her friend's disappearance after experimenting with dimethyltryptamine, finds herself seeking out an eccentric writer with many controversies who possibly supplied him with the DMT. What follows is mysterious radio broadcasts, drugs, a government cover-up, video co-pilot. Are they searching for something, or is something searching for them? This one is first because although it features a minuscule amount of actual found footage, that being the very short intro,
Happy times.
No, I didn't.
a ton of people still mention it in tow with the rest of the medium, most likely due to the fact that the camera work for the film is fully handheld and constantly at eye level. So it feels as though the cameraman is a character, but that's not the case. Even on my rewatch, it took me like 20 minutes before I realized it wasn't a diegetic camera, so I honestly can understand the confusion. Nevertheless, this film is an eclectic mix of Lovecraft and conspiracy with drugs. It starts out with a mystery, and as the main character uncovers more, it leads to revelations of otherworldly influence and the opening up of the mind, allowing perception of a broader range of wavelengths. The fun of the film really comes from Ted Levine, playing an aged Hunter S. Thompson if he fused with the Unabomber, and the twisting of the story of From Beyond to be about DMT, MKUltra, and my favorite, radio signals. However, the Lovecraft is downplayed in favor of bloody zombie stuff and fitting in jump scares wherever they can, which is a giant bummer to me because I was invested in what they were doing. The ice cream truck, the use of number stations, some conspiracy dripped in, but I kept getting dragged back out. There's even a name drop of From Beyond and H.P. Lovecraft in the film.
Have you ever read any H.P. Lovecraft?
Like, come on, man. It's like if Bad Omens name dropped Bring Me the Horizon on their first album. Like, I get it already. When you name drop From Beyond, I just want to go read From Beyond. Europa Report. The crew of Europa 1 are sent to Europa, one of Jupiter's moons, in order to gather samples and hopefully find evidence of extraterrestrial life among the stars. As they land, all communication is lost with Earth, and they must push on to complete their mission. Issues keep arising as they struggle to finish and depart. Meanwhile, something is glowing in the waters beneath them. Is that the ice truck killer? As far as the technical aspect, it's shot well with tight corridors aiding the claustrophobia, with a very sleek and clean aesthetic of the interiors that doesn't go too far into sterile territory, maintaining a bit of the modern ruggedness that I like. It mixes the found footage diegetic camera on the spaceship with a corresponding documentary setup back on Earth, reflecting on the events. serving as a disconnected non-linear narrative, while we simultaneously see what actually happened to the crew. It definitely achieved a lot for what they had as far as a budget, but when we talk about budget, we realize this film was cooked before it even started. And given that it's a found footage film, yeah, it had the potential to eclipse and make it all back, but we know how that usually goes, sadly serving as an example of why you don't put big money towards found footage projects. Back to the story. While all the actors did do a good job, I would have really liked if it were just the record kept by Rose, acting as a voiceover narrative in framing, then cutting through the found footage parts, keeping things strictly from her perspective. As it stands, nearly all character moments feel heavily rushed for character building rather than naturalistic, on top of ping-ponging back and forth with the characters. It just feels like a bit too much was on the plate for a film that needed to be character-driven. At the end of the day, though, Europa Report is one of the better sci-fi found footage films, and one thing I did really like about this film is that although they included a good bit of action moments, they didn't make the creature an antagonist. Lovecraft's creatures were rarely directly antagonistic to the stories, usually depicted as just straight up indifferent to human existence, or curious. That's what Europa Report really nails about the cosmic, that the world is much larger than we know, and there are much older and bigger things than us. Masking threshold. A man who has been suffering from a weird hearing impairment that doctors claim is just tinnitus takes a few days off work to document his experiments into finding a cure or at least answers for his illness. Days turn to weeks as the isolation and paranoia climb in unison as he gets closer and closer to an answer. One of the things that I enjoy about found footage is seeing the gear that the film is shot on in the film, which might be a reason why I gravitate towards it. This film was a weird mix of a YouTube video and auto documentary, as well as a minimal cast and setting bottle film, and the sound design, of course, being dialed up to 11. That really just was right up my alley. What I really like about this film is the relatability I had to the main character. Obviously not the self-important droning, I hope, but the main premise is that this guy is plagued by a medical illness that keeps getting worse, and doctors seem to be of no help, as it drives to further isolate him. I won't delve too deeply, but the most isolated I've ever felt was when I was constantly being hospitalized for blood loss and infection from Crohn's disease and Clostridium difficile, resulting in me being quarantined, my family unable to visit me, and nurses refusing to bring me water because they'd have to put on the suit and the mask and the gloves, walk in, and then walk out and take all those things back off again. It's why I have a particular interest in medical horror. It hits very close to home as someone who spent years in and out of hospitals. And if I can make a good list, maybe I'll make a video on that soon enough. So the relatability of the character drew me into the story at hand. Him also being gay and with a dad who doesn't have legs felt a little too oddly close of a relation, but I was hooked the whole way through. As far as the Lovecraftian, it's all there in my opinion. His impairment is a result of a very specific scientific experiment that he was running with sound frequencies that spurred on and spiraled out of control. The whole film, he's trying to find out what that sound is, recreate the experiment that started it, and just understand what it even means. It sort of crumbles in the last few moments for me, minor changes, yada yada, but all in all, the film's slow descent into self-induced insanity was a real roller coaster. Inevitable, but a fun ride nonetheless. I accept that this is absolutely not for everyone. If you are prone to eye-rolling when hearing long-winded rants from a very cynical and grating personality, then I can see why this would be a tedious movie to sit through. But I really dug this movie. Borderlands, also known as The Final Prayer. Amidst rumors of paranormal activity, or miracles happening at a church in the British countryside, the Council of Funny Hats send their top researchers to investigate whether to prove or disprove. What they will soon discover involves a religious practice that has been occurring much longer than the existence of the church. It's your typical haunted church film that is held up by the dynamic between the group of researchers, the believer, the skeptic, and the skeptical believer, who is one of my favorite character archetypes to explore in film. Sadly, these characters don't get to develop too terribly much, confined by the necessary conventions of the film that they exist within. While the majority of the film plays out like your typical Paranormal Activity knockoff, it's the odd vibes the townspeople give off, and the creeping dread that culminates in one of the most surprising endings in a film, let alone a found footage film, that really sets it apart from its contemporaries and makes it a very rememberable experience. To divulge the Lovecraftian beyond the bit in the synopsis would prove to be spoilerish. Taking a moment to talk about the technical aspects, one of the things you'll notice in a lot of found footage films is that they try to be unique and different by having some gimmick or other that makes their film stand out. Look no further than the Triangle that used a ton of split screen, or found footage 3D that filmed in 3D. While some gimmicks are fine and non-obtrusive, the gimmick here is that they're recording with mini cameras that clip onto their ears. Except the eye lines never match.
Whoa!
I'm sorry if I broke the illusion for you. So yeah, apart from the interesting skeptical believer and certain polytheistic themes, this film really struggles to hold your attention if you're not a newcomer to the conventions. My girlfriend walked in on quite a few movies while I was doing the research and reviews for this video, and I actually made her sit down to watch the final 10 minutes of this film. Just 10 measly minutes. And I strongly believe that's quite possibly the best way to view the Borderlands. If this was a 15-minute short film making runs at Fright Fest, it would have done numbers, dude. Our second to last found footage Lovecraftian film is Incantation. After spending some time in a psychiatric ward, a mother attempts to reconnect and reintroduce herself into her daughter's life. Soon after, her daughter becomes sick, with no signs of getting better, and the mom must revisit her past in order to save her daughter. This is another film with two storylines playing out at the same time, divulging information to the audience and converging at a big reveal. I really enjoy this type of narrative structure as it makes for an engaging way of drip-feeding information and building suspense. One of the things that Incantation does great in my opinion, and it's almost a bit to its detriment, is that for the majority of the film you're kind of left in the dark and purposefully missing crucial puzzle pieces necessary to fully understand it and what's really going on. While normally that's a great thing for rewatchability, I think that here it's perfect for a first watch and less so for rewatches. So if you intend to check this film out, going in as blind as possible is super important. So I can't spoil it by discussing too much, but I've already mentioned by this point my affinity for the Lovecraftian aspects they chose to go with here, and it's a great use of it. It also has a very unique twist on some culty stuff as well. Overall, Incantation does have some issues. It's very clunky at parts, and holy shit, this thing could have been trimmed by 30 minutes. But I find the interesting parts of it kind of overshadows its blemishes. It's also a Lovecraftian story centered on a nice theme discussing postpartum depression, guilt, regret, and just all around the difficulties of motherhood and self-sacrifice for the benefit of your child. While doing the selects for this film, it really reminded me of just how much emotion is in the film, and it really is great. We definitely need a lot more horror films that have heart like this. And if you're interested in something similar, I highly recommend Dark Water. And just make sure to bring a box of tissues. So, if you're into found footage, fine with subtitles, and no stranger to J or K horror, then this film is an absolute recommend. It's definitely a great introduction to Taiwanese horror, and very accessible to English-speaking audiences. So, when talking about both found footage and Lovecraft, there's probably a name you've been waiting to hear. Koji Shiraishi, one of the most prolific directors from Japan who specializes in found footage, and has a very strong penchant for the cosmic. The dude is coming up on 100 films directed, which is absolutely nothing to sneeze at, and the majority of these are what he refers to as fake documentaries, plenty of which employ Lovecraftian undertones in their writing. So let's take a look at a few of his films and jump straight in with A Record of Sweet Murder. A journalist is brought to an abandoned apartment complex by her childhood friend who insists that he's been committing murders under orders of a god who tells him that after a couple more it will result in the undoing of a tragic accident that happened when they were kids, resulting in the death of their dear friend. Shot with hidden cuts and made to look like one uninterrupted take, this single-setting minimal cast film develops before us like a theater play, using the found footage format to its fullest in regards to aiming for realism, with an ending that wraps it all up in a Lovecraftian bow. When I watched this film, the ending is really what stuck out to me. My cynical ass was expecting a certain negative, meaningless ending, given the nature of Lovecraft's work. But it actually surprised me and made me shake my fist in the air at the fact that more horror films don't have the balls to do shit like that. I really enjoyed it. And if you know any other films like it, then please send them my way. The next film from Shiraishi is Occult, After a stabbing occurs on a bridge, a documentary crew sets out to interview the survivors of the attack, finding a man who says that strange things have been happening to him ever since. Strange things that he refers to as miracles, that he thinks are stemming from the symbol that was carved onto his back on the bridge before the killer jumped to his death. The crew decide to stick around to capture one of these miracles on screen as the focus of their documentary shifts toward him. Occult starts off with a hook that gets you curious to see how the rest of the film plays out. Then quickly it calms down, ramping back up over the remainder of the runtime into the complete insanity of the finale portrayed uniquely and in a fun way. Occult also features a little cameo of fellow horror director Kiyoshi Kurosawa. We'll be coming back to that a little bit later. A lot of people don't like the end credits scene here, but personally, I don't mind it. It's weird and wacky, and that's clearly what they were going for. Nevertheless, Occult is a film surrounded by cosmic implications, a curse that gets passed on, and the influence of strange entities or gods, making it one interesting little film. Finally, if you've been around for a while in mainstream horror discussions, you already know which film is next. Our final film from Koji Shiraishi is Noroi, The Curse. A man who researches paranormal incidents decides to look into the case of a missing girl after her appearance on a game show that looks for psychic children. Chronicling his journey from the very beginning, we see as he unravels the mysteries, from the sound of babies crying to strange loops appearing everywhere, as he gets closer to finding out what really happened and how it all connects. We need justice for my guy, Mr. Hori, by the way. Easily Shiraishi's most popular film, and for good reason, as it perfectly encapsulates a Lovecraftian story in my opinion, with only a few minor changes. The dread, the unknowing, the very slow peeling back of a mystery revealing unexpected horrors, perfectly blended with the strong suits of Koji Shiraishi being at the helm. If it's one thing that you can expect from his films, it's how he nails the documentary film look, from the television segments down to the interviews and editing. It makes his films a real treat as someone who's a big fan of found footage. Noroi is a film that blends a bit of ghost and a bit of detective thriller up into one cool flick, with a lot of creepy moments that is easy to recommend to people wanting to expand their horizons a bit when it comes to movies. All this coming together to make a very engaging and naturalistic depiction of Lovecraftian horrors. Tier 1 of our 3-tier structure will be serving as home to all the Lovecraft-inspired films that don't feature horror at the forefront of their makeup. We'll be covering genres from science fiction and thrillers, a bit of action, and even romance, as we see some wonderfully crafted films that take the cosmic in interesting directions. Aniara. A woman specializing in a sort of virtual reality experience that shows people their memories of Earth works aboard a spaceship that shuttles people to the new colonies on Mars after Earth has now become completely uninhabitable due to prolonged and irreversible climate change, when they have to course correct in order to avoid a disastrous collision. This sends them on a years-long detour as the crew and members of the ship struggle to get back on their course. This film is very well shot, understanding completely the necessity for both long and longing shots, allowing the audience to soak in the dread alongside the crew of the ship, which has some really interesting set design. Another technical thing that I dig is the depiction of Mima's visions, which is the virtual reality thing, and how they truly evoke dreamy bliss. Also, they have raves? And an arcade? Fuck yeah, I don't care if we're hurling to our deaths. Sign me the fuck up. This film is a little long, admittedly, and it does get kind of weird at a certain point, but apart from just a couple of minor blemishes, what it does well. A slow burn that simultaneously depicts hopelessness against hopefulness. Humans won't just blip out of existence, at least not without putting up a fight. Aniara may not have tentacly monsters or fish cults, sort of, but what it does have is a horrifying depiction of mankind fighting inevitable extinction that has lingered in my brain ever since I watched it. It's depressing as shit, and therefore I love the fuck out of it. And that little glimmer of beauty at the end of the film is just a wondrous cap on top of it all. Coherence. A group of friends are holding a catch-up get-together party on the night that Miller's Comet is set to be passing overhead, when suddenly the power cuts off for the entire neighborhood except for themselves, and as they soon discover, one other house down the street. Things go from odd to straight up weird as they find a box at the other house containing an assortment of objects, including pictures of everyone at their party. Oh, and hi Xander. Whether intentional or not, the camera movement is handheld with no headroom and focus is constantly going in and out, leading to a very anxiety-inducing atmosphere. I think the script has its fair share of issues, particularly when it comes to the front end of the film, but once things get rolling, and although there are a ton of moving parts that might be a bit difficult to follow along with, the movie does manage to hold your hand pretty effectively through all the parallel willy wonkiness of the story. What's happening in the film is that supposedly this comet has caused a freak occurrence, and the house down the street is actually an alternate dimension of their own. This revelation leads to panic among the group. What are their motives? Are they evil versions of themselves? And most interestingly, once things get really going, who among them are from their house and not the one down the street? It's really when this part of the plot gets going that my interest spikes, and also combined with the comet, it makes it a pretty cosmic film that takes the whole parallel dimension stuff and goes to fun places with it. Sphere. After the American military discovers an unidentified spacecraft at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean, they bring in the guy who wrote the protocol several years ago on how to deal with this sort of thing, as well as the team of experts that he listed. Once they get to the ship, they find that it's not alien at all, and instead is American, and that aboard it is a giant, perfect sphere of unknown origin. Sphere finally takes us underwater at the site of a crash landing of essentially a UFO, and as the story unfolds, its cosmic influence reveals itself in a very refreshing way that still manages to bring some horror elements along with it. What the sphere is doing is manifesting the dreams or desires of the person interacting with it, which is something close to another film that we'll be discussing later, and it's just a fascinating topic. We'd like to think that humanity could use something like the sphere for good. Cure world hunger, making the switch to clean energy easier, or a viable non-meat solution for people with finicky stomachs. You know, just the important stuff. But we all know what really would happen in a scenario like this. And by the time the movie starts pondering these questions, it's over. I really would have loved to see even more of this film, as it felt like it was just getting started. I do still have plans to read the book by Michael Crichton eventually, though. Still a very good rendition of cosmic horror. The Last Wave. A lawyer in Australia is set to defend in court a group of Aboriginal men after a suspicious drowning is ruled a homicide. He begins having strange prophetic vision dreams that heavily feature water, storms, and drowned bodies, as he uncovers an unlikely connection. Peter Weir is no stranger to Lovecraftian themes. His previous film, Picnic at Hanging Rock, is similarly lumped into Lovecraftian discussions, as it centers on a boarding school's response to a group of girls going missing with no real answers and constant attempts at uncovering the truth. But while Picnic is a sort of, yeah, that is kind of Lovecraftian now that you mention it, The Last Wave is more like, oh, yeah, heavy watery and sea themes and underground cult, here uniquely depicted as an Aboriginal tribe, ancient relics, genealogical revelations, and tying it all up with prophetic cosmic visions of a coming apocalypse in the shape of an eco-disaster. This film hits several points of Lovecraft expertly and delivers a harrowing, dread-filled rendition of cosmic horror and humanity's inevitable and inescapable death. 10 out of 10. This film also has some fucking killer camera work. Both compositions and masters, the pacing and the score are both amazing. I really just dig drones in scores apparently, especially when it works so well with the themes. I knew that I was in good hands here with Peter Weir, but still, this film managed to completely blow me out of the water. Pun intended. Pontypool. An abrasive radio host settles into a small town and begins his new position, when a report breaks out about a riot happening at a doctor's office that soon spreads all over town, turning people into drones that attack and mutilate each other. The crew at the station slowly piece together the root of the virus and try to concoct a plan in order to slow or stop its spread as the horde makes their way to them. Although the film does fall victim to the one dude in the theater exclaiming that there's nothing happening, resulting in a third act filled with unnecessary action, what's going on here is so fascinating to see unfold that I can sort of excuse the basically zombies. I really do enjoy the basis of a thought virus. Here, a virus that spreads through language. I could absolutely see a later Lovecraft story about how a specific word or string of words kinda sleeper agent-like unlocks the ancient DNA in maybe the Cthulhu cult or something or other. Pontypool takes place all within a single location and has a minimal cast, making it feel very much like a stage play, which I adore. There's also a companion piece radio play version of the story that has all the characters returning, and a changed third act that, in my opinion, is for the better. Despite the film's reliance on tell, not show, it manages to convey enough imagery for the audience to get the picture, as well as maintain attention very well, no doubt because of the superb editing on display. If you're a huge fan of bottle movies like I am, I'd hope that you've already seen this, but if not, then absolutely go check it out. A very fun and engaging twist on a Lovecraftian premise. She dies tomorrow. After buying a house, Amy is seemingly aware that she will cease to exist the coming day, and after a conversation with her friend who is there to help her, leads to her as well feeling her own impending state of deceasedness, they both realize that the thoughts they are having might be contagious, as they unintentionally spread it around their friend group and town. I rarely write Letterboxd reviews, but looking back at this one is funny. Directed by Amy Seimetz, so you can expect some bloody disgusting regulars and even just big names in film in general. It's a bit of an indie film released by Neon, but it has competent and at times luscious cinematography. I am a big fan of lower budget films in general, so no wonder I enjoy the look and feel of this film. Speaking of low budget, it also features some mumblecore-ish dialogue between characters. For example, the dolphin conversation.
No, I'm telling you, you guys, dolphins are down to fuck.
Oh, God.
That always just sets films like this apart in a unique way. It's pointless in the story, but it's one of the main things that I remember about the film. She Dies Tomorrow is another that touches on the theme of thought viruses. Here, it's an existentiality that, upon even considering it, everyone is crippled and overcome with immense mortality-centric dread. It's a fun little absurdist trip. Quatermass and the Pit. Now, I'm just not that big of a fan of sci-fi as a standalone genre. Alien, cool. Solaris, also cool. But the more, I don't know, it feels like Star Trek, the less I'm interested. So instead of boring you with my gripes with these films that are more just my non-preference for the genre they are nestled within, I'm going to quickly go over them and talk about the cool Lovecraftian stuff that they do. Starting with the Roy Ward Baker-helmed Quatermass and the Pit from 1967. Workers are extending an underground tunnel in Hobbs End. If you know, you know, when they discover a strange artifact beneath the earth, an anachronistic human skeleton. Professor Quatermass shows up at the site of the dig as they examine what they now know to be a spaceship and search for answers. If it's one thing that Hammer always gets right, it's set design. Yeah, the color of the film is striking and gorgeous, but the set design always steals the show for me. Here, especially the kaleidoscopic interior of the unearthed spaceship. I just can't get enough of it. Featuring some Ghostbusters and some Rob Zombie music videos, the story here is a bit of Shadow Out of Time, bit of At the Mountains of Madness, and overall one big creative mashup of several pieces of Lovecraft's work that manages to tell a fun story. X, the man with X-ray eyes. A doctor attempting to extend the visible wavelength of humans is on the cusp of scientific revelations if only pesky regulations would stop getting in the way. He says fuck it, and begins experimenting on himself with his newly developed and ill-tested chemical eye drops. What starts off as small advances turns into too much to handle, as the doctor gets more sight than he bargained for. This is a neat premised little sci-fi flick from the legend Roger Corman, but really the only time it felt like an actual Roger Corman film to me was when the main character was peeping some nip. It's a very standard sci-fi film in most regards, but where it deviates from this is towards the end, after a bit of a weirdly paced film, where he starts peeling back the curtain of reality itself with his vision, and peers at the truth laying beyond the universe that exists unbeknownst to everyone else. Also, hi Dick, oh my god. Before we get into the last of the sci-fis, quicker honorable mention for Horror Express, a confined horror film that deals with a body-swapping ancient entity attempting to make it back to a spaceship in order to return home. With this very interesting piece not taking up nearly enough of the film, it still manages to have some merit, with the acting chops of Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing always being a treat. Alongside essentially Rasputin, Horror Express plays out essentially like The Thing, but on a train. Speaking of, The Thing from Another World, Scientists and military officials stationed at the North Pole discover a weird blip on their radar and head out to investigate, discovering the crash landing of what they determine to be a flying saucer. Nearby, they find its pilot encased in ice. They extract it and bring it back to base as they wait out the coming storm. A lot of the films from Hollywood during this era followed a strict set of rules when it came to coverage and editing as well, so no real complaints here for cinematography as it gets the job done, and DPs most likely weren't able to stray too far from the beaten path. And as far as color goes, yeah. I have minor complaints with the conventions of this era of filmmaking, but that's all they really are. Gripes. But what I will say is that, like Quatermass in the Pit, the set design here is very well done and helps to make it stand out. And the scene where they discover the ship must have been a real trip to see on the screen back in the day. I really enjoyed how, in true Lovecraft fashion, the alien here was likened to a plant organism. Obviously inspired by At the Mountains of Madness, they bring his ass back to the shop and he awakens, startled, scared, and not knowing where he is. And I like that. Counter to the holy shit what the f- of the thing, the antagonist here is much more sympathetic. This is the best of the mentioned sci-fi films, and I really enjoyed my fourth rewatch of it a lot. So that just about caps us off for this tier, but there's some more films to talk about that take Lovecraft into different genres. Spring. After the death of his mother following a long fight with cancer, a man loses his job before taking his friend's advice and getting away for a bit. No, he doesn't go to Florida, he goes to Italy, where he takes up a job on a farm in return for a place to stay. There he meets an enigmatic woman that seems to be hiding something from him. Hey Jeremy. Starring Lou Taylor Pucci, looking nothing like the guy that got his shit fucked up in Evil Dead, and directed by the Lovecraftian dynamic duo of Aaron Moorhead and Justin Benson. And if you know who they are and are expecting something, just wait, it's coming later. Spring takes Benson and Moorhead's deep-running Lovecraft inspiration and morphs it into a sweet romance story. Something that surprisingly works really well once you move the impending doom to a much more personal scale. And I find it kind of wholesome that the existential topic at play here is actually the acceptance of mortality. As the film progresses, it packs on the Lovecraft. Shapeless immortal being, older than old, heterochromatia, discussion of religions, and honestly, one could make the argument that the main character's fascination in all of it is a bit like Lovecraft himself, who in one way feared what he didn't know, but devoted so much time into exploring all of its crevices. I didn't intend for that to sound dirty. Apologies. This is just an absolute gem of a film that feels wholly unique and in a league of its own. I really enjoy this film. Now, there's not really a lot of Lovecraftian romance movies, so what if we blended some Lovecraft with some comedy? Glorious. Drained and distressed after a long road trip post-disastrous breakup, a man settles in for the night at a rest stop where he gets drunk and has a bonfire for one. He wakes up the next morning and heads into the bathrooms to ease his hangover when the man in the stall beside him strikes up a whimsical conversation that he soon will find has immense significance. Hey, it's the dude from Dead Silence. Looking an awful lot like Joel Haver. And also J.K. Simmons in this, that's cool too.
Yes, that's it.
Despite being made by the same person who did Elevator Game, this film is actually a very promising outing. What the fuck happened? Glorious is a low-budget bottle film that does a lot with its limited space and funds in order to bring the cosmic to the confines of a rest stop, with a ton of comedy sprinkled throughout, which given the premise is inevitable. As I'm a sucker for bottle films, I think I'm a bit lenient on its more worse-for-wear aspects, such as the runtime or the cinematography, or the writing towards the end when it gets a little too heavy-handed, or even the lackluster VFX, but the more than frequent splattering of practical gore definitely makes up for that in my book. Nevertheless, in terms of the near-barren collection of comedic cosmic cinema, this was a fun little film that at the very least held my attention throughout, with a neat revelation at the end that tickled me. Another comedy film exploring Lovecraftian themes is John Dies at the End. David Wong, years after ingesting a strange chemical through accidental injection that opens up his consciousness to the greater unknowns of the universe, sits down with a reporter to recount the whole story to him. From parties with psychic Jamaicans and nippy dogs, possession, and even dimension hopping. Directed by Don Coscarelli. John Dies at the End. Don Coscarelli. Don Coscarelli. and starring a slew of big names from Paul Giamatti and Doug Jones to Daniel Roebuck and Clancy Brown. And if you're familiar with Video Game High School, then you recognize Chase Williamson as our lead, and it even has Jimmy freaking Wong in here too. The film is told through narration, as John sits and talks with the reporter in the Chinese restaurant, which is very in line with Lovecraft stories. The epistolary part, not the Chinese part. Lots of discussion on cosmic importance, understanding of the universe, humanity's role in everything, and time being not a line, but a flat circle. It really started to lose me towards the end when the dimension hopping started, which sucks because I really did dig everything else that was going on with the story, and especially its comedy and tone. The matter-of-factness that the main character has about cosmic understanding.
More side effects. It's always like this when I'm on the sauce.
And the camaraderie displayed in the first bit.
Now, John here has eyesight problems because of his constant masturbation, but I
just left me ultimately wanting something the same, but a little different. But don't get me wrong, despite its shortcomings, there were still a lot of fun things to chew on here. And plus, it's not that often that you get to see cosmic horror through a comedic lens. Apparently, the graphic novel that it's based on is way more Lovecraftian, and readers have said that the movie isn't exactly a good adaptation, so maybe I'll get around to checking those out. That about does it for the comedy films, so let's take a pit stop on our way to Tier 2 with some Lovecraft by way of disaster flick packed with action. Underwater. When drilling into the bottom of the Marianas Trench, a research facility experiences an earthquake and suffers catastrophic damage. The crew's last hope is walking across the seafloor in their diving suits in an attempt to make it to the remaining escape pods. They soon discover that it might not have been an earthquake that destroyed their facility, and they're not alone at the bottom of the deepest part of the ocean. If so much of Lovecraft is about the possibility of world-ending events coming to fruition, it's odd how few adaptations include that part in their renditions. It's refreshing to see. Rather, instead of the usual things are about to be happening, we just get things are happening, as Cthulhu and his, pack of Cthulhuwawas or something are emerging from the bottom of the ocean. It doesn't overstay its welcome, and it knows exactly what it's there to do. An action roller coaster featuring a big fuck you antagonist, all wrapped up in some beautiful cinematography and grading. Underwater manages to blend two genres that for some reason rarely mix, in a way that makes for a great popcorn flick. If we're going to be talking about action and cosmic, then we gotta talk about a fun one. While a lot of Guillermo del Toro's films include influence from Lovecraft, Shape of Water being a bit of a positive rendition of Shadow over Innsmouth, Hellboy having a Lovecraftian entity beyond a sky portal, and Guillermo himself trying to adapt At the Mountains of Madness for years, I want to showcase the one that's a bit different than the usual cosmic fare: Pacific Rim. In response to giant kaijus emerging from the depths of waters all around the world, Earth unites to create the Jaeger program and manufacture what are essentially mechs as they fight back against the creatures. Raleigh is a pilot of one of these mechs who, after losing his brother in a fight, left it all behind. But as the Jaeger program starts losing public favorability and funding in light of more frequent attacks, he is pulled back in as humanity wages one last strike in an attempt to save Earth. Pacific Rim is actually pretty damn inspired by Lovecraft, and it's all explicitly bared in one scene, where Charlie Day mind melds with a kaiju peering across the portal into their world, and gazes upon seas of enemies being readied for their attack. Mixing a bit of body swapping with a futuristic device akin to The Thing on the Doorstep and The Whisperer in the Darkness, as well as featuring a bit of At the Mountains of Madness with the alien race waging war in an attempt to lay claim to Earth. And of course, who the director is. The inspiration is undeniable, in my opinion. You could even make the argument that Newton and Gottlieb are two sides of the same coin inspired by Lovecraft himself. Gottlieb being the fear and understanding, but Newton the fascination and wanting to know more. I don't think this is a credible theory, but it's fun. The film itself is of course well shot, with a ton of oomph and hopefulness in its compositions as humanity bands together, alongside a catchy as hell motif that gets reworked for several different emotions, from triumphant to endearing and to just badass. I think the film does flounder a bit after the initial pairing settles, but besides that, it's a really fun ride that serves as an optimistic translation of a Lovecraftian story that shows mankind pushing back against a cosmic threat. And that does it for Tier 1. It's such a fun assortment of films because it really highlights just how transposable cosmic horror and Lovecraftian influence can be, from slow burns with no antagonist, all the way to rock'em sock'em robots, and even one of my favorite romance films ever. All great films in their own ways, and such unique and interesting mashups of genres that I'm really glad I got to discuss. Tier 2 is where we start drifting more into horror territory, and we will be covering films that bridge the gap between the dominant genres of horror and thriller or science fiction, films that have created some seriously amazing blends of cosmic dread. Sea Fever. After drifting into an exclusion zone, a fishing boat is taken hold of by a giant glowing creature on the sea floor. Once they're free from the creature, they begin to head back, but not before discovering a possible infestation aboard their boat. Oh hey, a tentacly monster underwater. This is so Lovecraft. Yeah, I get it. Obviously, this film will draw that comparison pretty easily, but my mind focused on another aspect of it in conjunction with the giant multi-appendaged RGB strip at the bottom of the ocean. After the crew's first encounter, they begin to notice that they might be infected by something, as it slowly takes over each member over the course of the film. Any themes of your body not being your own kind of flips that Lovecraft switch to me, and using it here with an unexplained parasitic creature that honestly is just beautiful to look at was wonderful. It's almost an odd version of cosmic bliss with a tinge of horror. Black Mountainside. After the unearthing of a potentially older than previously thought possible structure in the frozen north of Canada, say the line, Bart.
Aliens.
A professor is brought to an archaeological dig site to aid in possibly dating the discovery, as well as to report back on anything that the crew may need moving forward. Soon, things start going south. The native workers disappear, presumed to have returned to their reservation. All communications are cut off on the site, and a few of the members experience hallucinations as the isolation starts to get to everyone. I get to talk about this film again. Yes! This little Canadian low-budget flick is one of my favorite films. If you're interested in seeing a much longer discussion on it, I point you toward my Wendigo video, where I explain why it's in the Wendigo video. Black Mountainside is oozing with atmosphere, isolation, and dread as a group of researchers unearth a strange artifact that is anachronistic to our understanding of timelines and regions. And its uncovering also leads to the spread of a self-destructive disease among the group as they panic and attempt to leave. But there's a cosmic force at the tree line that seeks to keep the infection quarantined. Pair this astronomically intriguing premise with the film's sparse use of music, opting for drones and forcing you to experience the quiet isolation alongside our protagonists, lots of beautiful shots of forests, I'm happy, and an uncanny valley taxidermy deer god, and you have one hell of a slow burn psychological thriller that I can't get enough of. Invasion of the Body Snatchers. In San Francisco, yep, I'd know those roads anywhere. A woman brings home a strange flower that she found as she begins noticing weird changes in her boyfriend's behavior, eventually feeling that he has been replaced by someone or something else. The paranoia and isolation builds, and she witnesses several instances of similar imposters around town, as well as odd gatherings. Now we're talking, featuring an all-star cast of people who were very popular for the time, as well as people who would go on to be even bigger, at the head of which being one of my favorite actor dads. Invasion of the Body Snatchers is a great, slow film that increases the tension over time, with an overwhelming sense of dread looming over it. The Lovecraftian aspects are also off the charts. Aliens that have no true form, after their own planet meets its end, send out feelers to find a new planet to inhabit. Secret cult vibes as the numbers steadily climb and shift in favor of the imposters, combined with the body isn't your own body swap shenanigans we've discussed before. The cinematography is filled with voyeuristic views and Dutch angles that actually work here really well as it ramps up the unease, backed with a lovely score that gets experimental at times with pounding warbles and odd instrumentation, all pulled together at the end with a punch that serves as one of the most iconic shots of horror. The Gate. A young boy wakes from a nightmare to discover that his treehouse tree is being taken down by workers. Alongside his weird friend, he finds a geode underneath where the tree was, and after getting a little bit of blood on it, strange things start happening, leading to a hole in his backyard that is seeping evil entities into the world. With his parents away on vacation and not needing to know of the multiple parties that his older sister is having, it's up to the kids to push back against ancient evil. Trying to recollect this movie I saw when I was 9 and haven't seen since, I failed to understand why so many people would add it to Lovecraftian lists. I remembered it pretty openly claiming it was a portal to hell, and of course I remembered the cat's eye-esque creatures. And I just thought it was an overall normal horror film experience. But it actually has a lot more than I remembered. The weird friend archetype that I love so much, word to Evil Ed,
"Oh, you're so cool, Brewster!"
is obsessed with some metal records that he got from his dad that talk of Lovecraftian portals to other dimensions and old ones that continue into later discussions in the film. So, hey, there is a minor Lovecraft influence that was taken in a different direction. The greatest part of this rewatch for me was getting to see more of my favorite era of practical effects, so long as we're not talking about gore specifically, wonderfully displayed alongside a charming plot centered around a group of kids as they stop a world-ending catastrophe through the power of love and self-sacrifice. It also has a young Stephen Dorff before he tried ice skating uphill.
Some motherfuckers are always trying to ice skate uphill.
Don't scratch it.
So that's neat. The Block Island Sound. A man is worried after his father has frequent moments of unresponsiveness, as well as disappearing on his boat late at night with no memory of what happened or where he went. His sister is sent to investigate the strange deaths of fish around the island when the father disappears again. This time, he doesn't come home, and his body washes ashore. Another one that I've already discussed, Block Island Sound takes the cosmic and restructures it around a family's struggle with the aftermath of their father's dementia. Genealogy kind of plays a part in this, with the fact that some predisposition for or early onset dementia can actually be hereditary. Regardless of how common this actually is, it's something that affects and worries people who see it affecting their family, and especially their parents. So taking these very real worries and fears dealing with mental illness and translating it with a Lovecraftian flair, along with great atmosphere and cinematography, was very well done in my opinion. I still highly recommend this movie. Messiah of Evil. Narration from a woman in a mental ward segues us into the beginning of her story as she is searching for her missing artist father, heading to his house in a place called Point Dune, an odd little seaside town that during the day looks practically abandoned, and at night comes alive with its peculiar residents, as talks of a coming blood moon arise. Feeling like a few Lovecraft stories incorporated into the overarching story of Shadow over Innsmouth, mixing a bit of vampirism and the Donner Party into a culty little story that doesn't seek to answer any questions. This film starts to get really interesting towards the end, as the town's mystery begins to unfold and paint a more clear, but still unfinished picture. I was shocked to see that this was such a buried film, but after I finished it, it made a bit more sense, as it's most likely due to the lackluster story at play here, where nothing really gets explained, from character motivations to what's even really happening. Which sucks, because goddamn, this is a beautiful looking film that is drenched in that mesmerizing, surreal, dreamlike atmosphere and a preference for the quiet, unsettling brand of horror that really could have sized up to be something great. Nevertheless, Messiah of Evil, if you're a fan of the story beats of Shadow over Innsmouth, and specifically seeing how they can be twisted and turned into new narratives, as well as a fan of the technical side of filmmaking, Messiah of Evil is a real treat. Annihilation. After her husband suddenly returns after being missing for an undisclosed amount of time, a woman is brought into a government agency where they have been trying to enter an area to document and research a strange anomaly, after a meteor had crashed into a lighthouse, creating what they call the Shimmer. She joins them as they make one last attempt to enter the zone, one last effort at getting answers. Obviously, the cinematography is top-notch, but the film's audio landscape is similarly well crafted, not only with a good soundtrack picking songs that tie in thematically, but the score also carries us along, sometimes peeking out from the background, until near the end when it decides to flat out flex on us with a specific piece that works immaculately within the context of the scene, hammering home the eldritch. clearly taking notes from The Color Out of Space, involving an area affected by a spreading, wildly colorful and translucent material that showed up post-meteorite crash near a farm and appears to be changing things on a cellular level. But also, the alien force here is yet again just another being that isn't seeking to dominate the world or destroy all humans. It's simply trying to understand us as much as we are trying to understand it. With themes of grief and trauma, humans changing, cancer, the ever-multiplicating cell that skips death being one of the leading causes of our own demise, the discussion of cells and how they die, meaning that on average they're completely replaced every 7 to 10 years, and not to mention that the meteorite originally crashed into a lighthouse, which is no happenstance. There's so much to dissect here that makes the film a joy to rewatch and find neat little things every time you do. Like, for example, on my most recent rewatch of this film, the importance of a simple glass of water. A reflection, twisted and refracted. It truly is the little things. Annihilation serves, at least for me, as a beautiful rendition of cosmic bliss. As life changes and alters us, and although life for some of us may cease, life also goes on. Pandorum. A spaceship is on a mission to carry enough humans towards an Earth-like planet in hopes of colonizing and continuing the human race. A man named Bauer wakes up to a ship that seems to have been powered down. He finds one other person awake and they band together to search the ship in order to figure out what's going on as the ship's power system is dwindling, and an unknown threat looms in the ship's halls, all while they have to avoid deep space psychosis, referred to as Pandorum. There is Lovecraft all over this film, the dire existentialism of a derelict ship that has the remnants of humanity, and a last-ditch effort to survive against all odds. Certain characters playing God, the devolved mutant creatures, as well as the paranoia and loss of sanity playing an important role in the story. There's also a wonderful reveal at the end of the film that just sheds light on everything, and somehow, thankfully, I forgot about on my rewatch for this, and it just makes for such a great experience getting to relive that. So do try to go in blind if you can. It absolutely sucks, but the over-reliance on action and the inclusion of the devolved creatures really does drag the film down for me. And if we took more times with the characters and the main story at play here, this could have been a phenomenal film. If you've seen this film and you understand what I'm saying, then please send any recommendations for films like that my way. Altogether, I still think Pandorum was a fine film, with tons of that good old cosmic existentialism. Uzumaki. A high school student is worried by her boyfriend's dad's sudden obsession with spirals, as he spends all day collecting and recording anything with a spiral shape on it, from snails to whirlpools and even his food. This obsession leads him down a terrible winding path that results in his accidental death as he puts himself in a wash cycle. At his funeral, he is cremated, and his ashes plume upward and contort into a spiral above the town, as the obsession spreads. Junji Ito took the golden ratio, something very important in filmmaking and composition, but also exists all throughout life, a mathematic proportion that frequently occurs naturally. It's kind of beautiful in a way. And with it, he created an enigmatic story centered on the spiral's natural yet not so natural feel, and combines it with obsession, which fits perfectly when discussing spirals, whirlpools that trap you and pull you down, deeper, until you get to the root. Despite being made before the manga finished, and thus not having the full, true scale of the cosmic story at hand, the film we got is actually pretty good. It's for the most part a very quiet film. As the events unravel and the town succumbs to the obsession, we are viewing it from the POV of our main character, as things are just happening and constantly changing or evolving. It's got all that early 2000s Japanese weirdness in the cinematography, emphasizing uneasiness, that I dig a lot. And it even has an odd grade that really starts to grow on you as the film progresses. Watching this back for selects, the cinematography really stuck out to me. A lot of fun movements inspired by the theme of spirals that make it such a visually interesting film. You just know that they had fun coming up with and executing all of these movements. Uzumaki is a neat film, in its own special way. The Lighthouse. The day before 2 lighthouse operators are set to be picked up from their post, a storm swiftly approaches, leaving the 2 men stuck on the island until another is sent for them, with no idea of how long that may be. As tensions rise, the isolation slowly gets to them, and sanities begin to falter. What else is there to say about this film? It was the cap to my aquatic horror video, so I went pretty in-depth there. I guess we'll go full in with the Lovecraft here. So, although Eggers himself has stated a much more gothic inspiration from the likes of Poe, the overarching theme of insanity at potentially cosmic revelations is obviously very Lovecraftian. The characters are heavily isolated on an island in a vast ocean that serves to hone the rising tension and over the course of the film break down their mental fortitude. It's a bit Lovecraft by association, but goddamn does it fit the bill. It's also just a phenomenally shot film that is just awe-inspiring to look at. I guess I'm just really into the technical side of filmmaking alongside having heavy preference for stories with interesting premises or routes that they take, so this film just always feels like it's made for me. The only thing that's really missing is 12-second wide shots of a forest. Or a werewolf. But hey, you never know. Eggers could want to do a werewolf film next.
I said Robert Eggers would do a werewolf film as a throwaway joke. I didn't actually expect it. And then we get news. You have no idea how excited I am for this shit. The last winter. Ron Perlman is the head of a research team digging around the Alaskan tundra for the best locations to set up shop and frack till the caribou come home. A couple of environmentalists show up and rock the boat. Perlman wants to frack, but the man keeps putting him down. Soon, characters start experiencing hallucinations in the frozen wasteland. The group tries to rationalize, maybe it's gas seeping up from the ice, maybe it's psychosis. But eventually, everyone just agrees on the necessity of evacuating the research facility, which is becoming an increasingly difficult task to accomplish.
She's a piece of ass, right?
This is one of the films that it took me seeing it on a letterboxd list for Lovecraft to go, nah, this guy's smoking crack. Hey, wait a minute. And yeah, this is actually really cosmic in its approach, and combining that with Facinden's love and appreciation of the Wendigo is a fucking blast. Essentially, these researchers are looking for the next fracking spot. Fuck the environment, I guess. And they get too close to a site of, I guess for this video, we can just say an ancient race of caribou Thulus that upon their resurrection bring about hallucinations as well as the snowpocalypse. And honestly, looking at this as a Lovecraftian film makes me like it a lot more than I already did. It has Ron Perlman. What more could you ask for? But seriously, so much more of the film makes sense and hits harder while looking at it through a cosmic lens. The Wendigo stuff is now just sprinkles on top of the sundae. Dark Waters. After her father's death, a woman travels to an island in the Black Sea to find out why her dad had been donating large sums of money to a convent over the years. There she finds nothing but vague half-answers and mysterious going-ons with the nuns, as she uncovers the divine purpose that is intended for her and what's really been going on at the church. I like movies that kind of use the Cthulhu mythos or the wider Lovecraft stories as a sort of grab bag, as it feels like that's the intended way to branch off in different directions. You pick a bit of this, and you pick a bit of that, and then you flesh out an entirely unique to itself experience. And that's what Dark Waters does so well. A culty mystery surrounding a seaside convent of nuns that engage in frequent rituals, a blind oracle painter locked in the basement, the Mother Superior is also blind and seemingly lost sight after peering at some entity, the importance of an ancient relic that if made whole again would bring untold calamity, and of course, the main character's link to the convent. It's a very slow-going film for the most part, with emphasis on mood more than anything, so obviously I really dug those parts. It does introduce a lot of action towards the end, but the effects on display are nice and gory, and the film just keeps getting weirder from there. Dark Waters is such a unique, dreamy kind of mystery film that cares way more about the way the film feels than anything else, which, adding on top of that all the Lovecraftisms, makes it a real treat. I didn't think I would enjoy it nearly as much as I actually did. Marebito. Fascinated by seeing a man commit suicide, a cameraman obsessed with fear goes on a journey that leads him to an underground world that exists below Japan. There, he encounters a chained-up woman that he saves, taking her back to his apartment to care for her as his new fascination. Directed by J-horror icon Takashi Shimizu, who brought us Ju-on, as well as written by Chiaki J. Kanaka. So you already know a bunch of Lovecraft is aped by Kanaka, and it's all handled very well by Shimizu. The main character here, a bit unreliable, and his obsession and desire to understand what horrifying sights the homeless man in the tunnel saw, that leads him to a Lovecraftian underground city
the jankiness in the depiction of which is actually very cool in my opinion. It also kind of has a sort of found footage type of camera work sometimes, with lots of screener stuff, but is entirely told through non-diegetic cameras. All the play of found footage with no mess. Tons of ambience and time to ruminate with our main character makes this a slow and thoughtful film that has an engrossing atmosphere of CRTs and voyeurism, bringing with it the evergreen discussion of the part a viewer plays in recorded violence, viewing the world through a lens, what's really real, a dissociative discussion, and whatnot. Very fun stuff. The end of the film also shines a new light on what came before it, making an already interesting film with its musings on pain and death into a much more realistically dark film. And I can't help but love when films do this. It doesn't always work, but when it does, it recontextualizes the rest of the film in a way that elevates its enjoyability a noticeable amount. Before we get into the next film, I'd like to quickly go over some honorable mentions, because I couldn't find another place to put them. Nope, while not falling under either label of cosmic or Lovecraftian horror, Jean Jacket is built up initially as a giant mystery, including some invisibility that leans into the unfathomable part of Lovecraft's antagonists, but ultimately Jean Jacket is revealed to merely be an animal, one that we don't really get too much of an answer for, making it a pretty good example of a Lovecraftian entity. Ghostbusters is a good example of how films can include cosmic influence without being cosmic themselves, as although I did mention in the previous video that it doesn't fit the bill for Lovecraftian horror, Ghostbusters does have a villain that is very Lovecraftian in nature. It's just what they do with that villain that pushes the story so far away from cosmic horror, as it's best described as a supernatural horror comedy. Smile is a film that's been stuck in my head for a couple of years now, thanks to ending on such a high note with some sick cinematography. But it's also a bit Lovecraftian in its premise, with a thought virus of severe depression spreading amongst its characters. The Faculty, one of my favorite guilty pleasures, is very close, with its weird alien antagonist coming down and taking up hosts, a la the invasion of the Body Snatchers, on top of being aquatic creatures that shapeshift, bringing the film even closer to the comparison. Under the Skin feels very cosmic, centering on an alien that gets no real backstory or motivation for what it's doing, as the cinematography and feel of the film heavily evokes mystery and looming dread. Hellraiser, where the cosmic aspect of it, that being the Cenobites and the realm that they came from, and also sort of Leviathan from the second one, it's such a small part of it, while being entirely its own unique and interesting thing, which is why I didn't really want to lump it in with the rest. A bunch of folk horror films seem to skirt the line of folk and cosmic, like Gaia and Apostle, both having seemingly eternal and eldritch gods older than old, and not fully antagonistic. Frequent zombie movies get labeled as cosmic inspired, such as Evil Dead or The Crazies, or even infection-based films like Splinter. And although I wouldn't classify them as cosmic or Lovecraftian, keeping the origin or extent of the virus unknown definitely is a very cosmic idea. And yeah, that does it for the quick additions. Now back to the video. The Mist. In the aftermath of a storm that tears through his town, a painter begrudgingly makes momentary amends with his neighbor in a joint effort to head to the store for some emergency supplies, where we see the many different faces of the community coming together for a moment after the disaster. Just then, a mysterious mist rolls in, bringing with it strange creatures lurking within, leaving the group locked inside the store as they must work together to survive. Stephen King has tons of influence from Lovecraft in his work, from Dreamcatcher to It, to his own version of the mythos with The Dark Towers. But of course I have to mention the one so frequently brought up in conversations of the cosmic variety. The Mist, directed by Mr. 343 King Adaptations Frank Darabont, is obviously going to conjure up thoughts of Lovecraftian horrors the most, as the creatures herein are either tentacled indescribable monstrosities or large eldritch insectoids, both of which very much would be at home within the pages of a Lovecraft story. But there is more still, as the mist itself, cloaking the otherworldly threat, has no concrete source besides the possibility of military experiments causing it. Combine this with the natural disaster, and it just makes it all the more odd. I used to not be as big of a fan of this movie, the clunky VFX that would have been helped by the planned black and white version, minor gripes with cinematography, yada yada. Until I stopped focusing on the creatures and the horror aspect, shifting more towards what I think is the true pulp of the story. The characters. Specifically the characters in all their differences, and how they come together or clash. It's truly fascinating and has made the film a much better experience than before.
Thanks to this, I've grown to enjoy the film over the years. It's also got a really notable ending, although I will always prefer other King adaptations that we might be getting to. Although Tier 2 is your standard horror experience, there's still a substantial amount of variance in the depictions of cosmic horror, and much to my delight, a fair bit of cosmic bliss, showcasing my personal interpretation of the reality of cosmicism. Now that we've covered the sci-fi, the thrillers, and the films that are horror but a little on the lighter side, Tier 3 is where we get to the good stuff. The good stuff being abject horror. We can now fully dive into more extreme avenues, where we'll find tons of blood and viscera with body and psychological horror films. The Gates of Hell trilogy. I have a confession to make. I'm not that big on Fulci. Don't get me wrong, I get it. Zombie came out and did amazing things for horror at the time, especially from a genre and grindhouse perspective. It's just, his movies have never done it for me. And I legitimately feel bad saying that. I'm not completely done with his filmography by any means, so maybe there is something there for me. But when it comes to Italian horror cinema, obviously I'm a Mario Bava guy, and then it's Argento, and then Fulci, Martino, Suavi, Diodato, you get the picture. Art before sleaze. It's just how my brain functions 9 out of 10 times. However, I still feel it's very important to note his Gates of Hell trilogy in this video, as the Lovecraft DNA, while minuscule, is still present. Each released within a 2-year span between 1980 and 1981, the films have interconnecting themes such as Catholicism, pretty blonde leads, eye torture, and Gates to Hell? City of the Living Dead follows the events after a priest's suicide, resulting in a gate to hell opening up and the dead beginning to walk the earth, as a reporter finds out that it must be closed by All Saints' Day or it'll get much worse. The film is set in Dunwich, obviously a nod to Lovecraft, and that's about the extent of the Lovecraft here, if you don't consider all zombies to be references to Reanimator. The Beyond features a woman who inherits an entire hotel in good old Louisiana. Renovations lead the way to murder, and people try to stop the grand opening of the hotel, as we find out the connections between the hotel and the Gates of Hell. This one has the most influence from Lovecraft, including the Book of Eibon playing a large part, blindness following Sights Unholy, and an actual bit of Reanimator with a hidden part of the basement revealing an alternate dimension. In this instance, just hell. It just sucks I had a hard time following along with the story. It does have a really cool score, too, with a nice motif. And of course, it has a lot of really sick gore. But despite the immense cult status of The Beyond, I actually liked House by the Cemetery the most out of the bunch. And that's with me watching the English dub.
Today I saw my new girlfriend again.
That fucking kid, dude. After a cold open reminiscent of Texas Chainsaw Massacre setting the mood up, we follow a family who are now moving into the same house temporarily. Alongside being located next to a cemetery, the house has a very creepy basement, with a long and gruesome history the family will soon uncover. House by the Cemetery is a very slasher-adjacent film mixed with a haunted house, which Fulci stated he wanted to feel like it existed in the same universe as Lovecraft's works, which makes sense, as the house, the one by the cemetery, is located in New England. House by the Cemetery had all the same stuff that was in the previous films, except here it was set within a very intriguing house with easily the best score out of all of them, and included a bit of an improvement to the cinematography to my eye. It also had a much more toned down story in comparison that introduces a ton of emotion for the characters involved. It's a much more personal story, and the importance placed on atmosphere is probably why I liked it head and shoulders above the others in the trilogy. It also has an ending that I'm very fond of. Honestly, after doing the selects for this video, The Beyond happened to grow on me a bit more. While I still prefer the scaled back approach of the House by the Cemetery, The Beyond is just a wild and fun ride with a lot of interesting visuals. So hopefully you understand what I mean by the very minimal Lovecraft in these, but they do frequently get brought up in discussions, so I thought why not blitz through them real quick, as they're still interesting and nowhere near as bad as some of the films that got cut from the list. If you like cheap gore and iconic Italian horror scores, then these films make for a great afternoon. Now, back to the rest of the movies. Cabin in the Woods.
Your stereotypical group of college kids all assemble in an RV to head out to the mountain Styx to visit their friend's cabin for a weekend excursion. Unbeknownst to them, a lab full of a mix of scientists and military are observing their every move on hidden cameras, as the group unleashes redneck zombies that hunt them down one by one, until one of the survivors puts things together and discovers what's really going on. I have a fun little story for this film, as for whatever reason my 13-year-old ass obsessed with werewolves watched the trailer for this film and thought it would be Evil Dead plus werewolves. Somehow. So yeah, I hated the fuck out of this movie the first time that I watched it. So once I calmed down a bit, about half a decade later, I rewatched it and enjoyed it for what it was. But this is the movie that made me stop watching trailers, which, given the way trailers have gone, wasn't a bad decision. As far as Cabin in the Wood goes, it's very hard to discuss without breaching into spoiler territory. The ending of the film kind of solidifies its cosmic aspect. But up until then, there's still some Lovecraft to chew on, like an underground facility almost cult-like in their activities, broaching on parody of the horror genre while still being self-aware and understanding the conventions enough to make it an enjoyable horror film. I think it's done really well here, and it's almost like a fan fiction in that regard, explaining away all those quirky nuances that are sometimes necessary in horror films. It's just a fun film that I'm glad that I gave another shot. The Beach House. A group of people staying at a beach house partake in some eatable marijuanas when it exhibits some laced-esque side effects, as everyone wanders around, seeing pretty lights, feeling the smooth water, and then a mysterious fog rolls in. The next morning, everyone wakes up feeling sick, as things take a sharp turn away from normalcy. My god, the fucking cosmic dread in this movie, mixing grotesque practical body horror into this existential whirlpool. The downfall of humanity being its neglect and outright abuse of the earth has got to be like top 10 themes for a film for me. When I watched it for the aquatic horror video, I was just blown away. It starts out relatively normal with some low budget indie vibes and then just starts to spiral. A big part of what I like about it is that there's no antagonists. Shit's just happening. You can't get much more Lovecraftian than this. The Blob. In quaint little Arborville, a group of teens are on a night out when they run into a homeless man who is currently being devoured by a gelatinous slime that's covering his hand. They, along with the town's delinquent with a heart archetype, take him to the hospital in hopes of helping him. The doctor shows up just in time to see the aftermath. His body dissolved on the hospital bed, and the blob now slowly making its way towards the town, absorbing everything in its path. This movie has everything. Those prime 80s foggy blue light forests, the gore, Babe Ruth, Jack Nance.
There was a fish in the percolator.
Directed by Chuck Russell, co-written by Frank Darabont, which we'll be getting to later. And it's also DP'd by frequent Cronenberg collaborator Mark Irwin. Which makes sense. The intro to the film, wonderfully choosing to highlight the town and its many interactions, plays out like the color out of space. The blob crash landing with the meteor and itself being very Lovecraftian. It's a goopy, kind of Shoggoth-y blob that is very animalistic in nature, not selecting targets or anything, but just existing. It's also sort of purple. Most importantly, the film understood what it needed to do when it came to the depiction of the blob, and especially how it kills. While some of it can be a bit comedic and the green or blue screen usage can kind of date the film, what's on display is some of the best to exist from a period that couldn't just do it in post, and had to use practical means to achieve the grotesque and gnarly. And as horror fans, that's how we like to do it. The Blob, to me, while being a fun film filled with comedy and a bit of camp, exists almost entirely as a testament to that notion, that there may be a dozen ways to dissolve a homeless man, but the best way is practically. Slither. Tell me if you've heard this before. A meteorite crash lands in a rural community, leading to an alien lifeform that slowly makes its way through killing the townspeople. Yeah, stranger things have happened. Here, the story centers on the town deputy and the wife of the now imposter, Michael Rooker.
Neat.
Who have to band together and stop the aliens' master plan of overtaking Earth through eating and breeding. Much like mentioned in The Blob, this is another film that takes the color out of space as a stepping off point for cosmic horror. But I just couldn't resist mentioning this one. James Gunn, Michael Rooker, Nathan Fillion.
Are you ready to finish this, bitch?
And given this tier's knack for the grotesque, I just had to talk about this movie because it's so fun. It's a great reminder that at the end of the day, film is meant to be fun. Yes, evoke emotion is above all, but being fun isn't bad.
bitch is hardcore.
We need the fun movies in order to offset the depression movies. While the Lovecraft stops at the same point a little bit after the comet stuff, and maybe you could argue an amorphous tentacle appendaged entity, it's got a ton of gore and a lot of comedy.
Get the fuck out of the way, cocksucker!
Morning, Mayor.
That jumps headfirst into action in the third act. Lots of Lovecraftian films tend to be serious, understandably so, but having it injected into a comedic film like this that absolutely does not take itself super seriously is such a joy. Dark Sea. A fisherman is out at sea when, after an uneventful day, him and his assistant dredge up a strange creature that attacks them, biting the fisherman before they throw his ass back in the water for being ungrateful for the free ride. That night is the grand opening of a new cabaret, where all the townspeople gather as the fisherman wakes up a changed man and on the hunt for blood. Very, very, very much inspired by the likes of Evil Dead and Dead Alive, the Lovecraft influence is very surface level. A fishing town, a disease that comes from a fishman in the sea that is turning people into zombie-adjacent creatures with a thirst for blood, and even a Necronomicon thrown in for good measure. Cosmic themes, however, do turn up at the end when much larger implications are revealed. Dark Sea also maybe accidentally has good trans representation. The character that owns the cabaret, Madame Ursula, wink wink nudge nudge, is either a drag queen or trans woman, and it's just nice to see that they exist as a character with their own wants and goals. And of course, once shit gets real, a fucking minigun. The film takes its time getting there, but once the blood starts to spray, it's a damn good time, filled with tons of practical gore and absurdity. If you had ever considered what Dead Alive might have looked like if it was made in Brazil, here you go. The Lords of Salem. Taking place in Salem, a DJ gets a personalized delivery containing a strange record. While listening to its rhythmic pounding and dissonant strings, she sees images of women engaging in cultish activities. As our main character gets introduced to her landlord's sisters and explores the weird vacant apartment number 5, the mystery of the song begins to unravel. Of course I had to finagle a Rob Zombie film in here. Of course we can't forget where I got my name from. The Lords of Salem is easily Zombie's slowest and, in my opinion, best film, which features the least amount of zombieisms while still taking time to show off his wife's ass. Much obliged. The Kubrick influence is out full force, with the best cinematography we've ever gotten from a zombie film helped out tremendously by the location, and subjectively herein lies the most badass score from a zombie film as well. It's understandable to not see the Lovecraft on the surface of a film that looks a bit more like Rosemary's Baby, but goddamn was this more Lovecrafty than I remembered. Lovecraft frequently wrote of witches, specifically having his own fascination with Salem and the witch trials that took place there. The film revolves around a song that puts all the women in Salem into a trance, as well as the coven's plot of bringing a long-time curse to fruition and using a blood descendant in order to birth their new king. That, if you'll allow me to grasp at straws for one of these, he looks a bit fishy. It's my favorite of Zombies films, and I always recommend it. Also, the song is just a banger, both the zombie song and the song in the film. Event Horizon. After the disappearance of the experimental space and time-warping ship Event Horizon, the worst space disaster on record... Oh, honey, I'm pretty sure that wasn't even the worst space disaster on record at the time that you filmed this. It suddenly reappears, and a ragtag group of blue-collar astronauts take along the ship's creator to investigate and potentially salvage it. When they arrive, they find the crew eviscerated and splattered across the walls. Only more questions arise, and they begin to suffer hallucinations as they attempt to return home. Starring so many big hitters from Sam motherfucking Neill to Sean Pertwee.
Boom, boom.
The film is directed by Paul W.S. Anderson, who gave us the masterpiece Mortal Kombat, and then this cult sci-fi horror flick, and never made another movie ever again, and most certainly his negligence on these non-existent film sets did not cause the death and severe injury of multiple stunt actors and crew. Now, a lot of people consider Event Horizon to be a Lovecraftian film. I disagree to a certain extent, but if I'm going to have my own little films that curt the line, I thought I might as well throw a bone to the fans of this balls-to-the-wall film. In the film, they constantly talk about opening portals to hell and whatnot. Constant heavy emphasis that what we're seeing is hell. The argument here is that it's only the characters in universe telling us that it's actually hell. It's an admittedly fun way to view the film that the entire conversation of hell is merely because that's the only way characters know how to verbalize what they're seeing and experiencing, and that they could absolutely be opening up a portal to a Lovecraftian realm. Event Horizon, to me, is a pretty fun experience, with a lot, but not nearly enough, of great practical effects that just aim to be as extreme as possible. A little bit of dated CGI to poke fun at, and an amazing set piece. The ship here is a perfect mix of that futuristic but rugged design that I love so much. The best part of the film for me is always just how fucking wild it gets. There are absolutely faults abound, editing and script-wise, but I recommend to just sit back and enjoy the glory that is Sam Neill in Space Hellraiser. Alien. On their trip home, a commercial space crew are ordered to investigate a distress signal coming from a nearby planet. As they enter the gargantuan halls of the alien ship, they find inside of it a deceased alien life form, as well as rows upon rows of egg sacs. After an egg bursts and attacks one of their members, they rush back to their ship and depart back on course for home, wondering just what they found and what it was that attacked them. And here we are. Finally, I'm getting around to it. So, going into making this video at the very beginning phase before I even started research, I contemplated even including this film. Maybe I'd just throw in Prometheus, given its more upfront inspiration, and mention Alien as a compromise, as it truly didn't feel Lovecraftian at all at the beginning. And then I happened to read At the Mountains of Madness, and now I get it. This is practically a translation of the first parts of At the Mountains of Madness, streamlined into more direct horror. It's also one of my favorite films, so hell yeah, I get to talk about it, and it also 100% fits the theme here. While the film does go a bit antithetical to Lovecraft and turn the antagonist into a literal physical thing that gets overcome and defeated in a way, I'm working with the assumption that someone at least tangentially interested in horror has seen Alien, so I apologize if I just spoiled the ending for you. Xenomorphs are purely working as animals that were designed to be world killers, and it's just doing its job here. Although that's using a bit of knowledge coming from later movies. Also, while the crew are observing and traversing the strange ship's interiors, it brings even more mysteries to the forefront that brings to question what really exists out there and how inconsequential humans are in the grand scheme of the universe. While Alien, completely ignoring the expanse of the mythos after its release, strays pretty far from what would be classified as cosmic, it's hard to now ignore the clear parts that were influenced by Lovecraft, no matter how small they may be. As far as the film itself goes, do I really need to say anything? It was way ahead of its time, with sublime set design, amazing atmosphere, and to fucking die for practical creature effects. It's one of the best films ever made. Baskin. A group of police officers, after having a sit-down meal together, are piled up in their squad car when they receive a call for backup that sends them to the other part of town, the driver noting that the road seems strange and oddly unfamiliar. Suddenly, they hit someone and veer off into a lake. They walk to their destination and find a deserted police station, and inside are the police officers who called for backup, as they venture deeper into the building in order to investigate. This film is very enjoyable cinematography-wise, as there are plenty of intriguing compositions, and the whole film has some pretty cool color grading with very exaggerated lighting that makes it a real visual treat. It also has great gore effects, and a pretty fun score and soundtrack. As far as Lovecraft goes, this one is a bit of a stretch in that regard, admittedly. Can Evernull's other film, Housewife, has much more going on for it that are Lovecraftian, but it suffers from some pretty severe pacing issues and isn't as good as Baskin in my opinion. So, with Baskin, once the ball gets rolling and the surreal, dreamlike aspects start showing themselves, we do get some Lovecraft in the nondescript religion cultish activities, and mostly the fact that all of this shit is happening, and there's just no explanation as to what the group walked in on. Heavy emphasis on dreams and the dream world feel of the film aids the insanity of everything happening, turning Baskin into one trip of a film. The Void. A deputy escorts an injured man to an understaffed and under-equipped hospital where his sort of wife works, and as they attempt to help the man, one of the nurses slips into a trance-like state and murders him.
She actually kills a separate patient.
It was uncurable. As the deputy heads out to call it in, he is met with cultists in the parking lot that have set up a perimeter, keeping the group isolated in the hospital as the night has just begun. Drenched in atmosphere and grainy aesthetic that at times puts style over substance while paying homage to 80s horror films, The Void is a fun ride as the minimal cast plays off of each other and slowly begin to understand why it is they're all gathered at the deserted hospital that night, and what otherworldly presence has seeped its way inside. Ultimately, while the film starts off strong, with its latter parts plagued by a lot of moments, there is still a substantial amount to chew on here. Being a huge Carpenter fan, of course I'm going to enjoy the visuals and the score so reminiscent of his early catalog. The creature designs and the purposeful usage of practical effects here itches that specific scratch for me, and the themes of fate and destiny as everyone's role is revealed, mixed in with a ton of cosmic inspirations and delivered with emphasis on atmosphere and feel, makes The Void a somewhat flawed but very wonderful film for me. As we put a close to Tier 3 and the end of this portion, let's end on a high note with one of the best directors of horror, John Carpenter, who released a bunch of amazing films that got a lot of praise, released a bunch of amazing films that didn't get the praise that they fully deserved, and then released some not as phenomenal films, and decided, fuck it, I'm going to retire and go play Nintendo. That's why he's my GOAT. Badass. Amongst the company of the celebrated cinema career of Carpenter exists a little trilogy of films that all bear very heavy inspiration from Lovecraft's works. Affectionately referred to as the Apocalypse Trilogy, we have The Thing, Prince of Darkness, and In the Mouth of Madness. But actually that's not all from Carpenter, as there's another little film from him that falls under the cosmic umbrella, Cigarette Burns. What we get here is a very cool story heavily inspired by The King in Yellow, a fictional play used in multiple of Robert Chambers' works that made anyone who read it go completely mad. But going back to the Apocalypse Trilogy, everyone and their mom has made 30-minute video essays sponsored by Raid Shadow Legends on The Thing. So I focused my efforts on the other two, and I almost chose Prince of Darkness, which takes a very Lovecraftian premise but pushes it a tad bit too far in my opinion towards religion, and starts dealing with absolutes of morality and sin, while still remaining cosmic in its tone. Although this is one of Carpenter's more harshly rated films, I quite enjoyed this rewatch. The worker ant motif, the use of mirrors, and just seeing a bunch of actors that I love, as well as the to-be-expected kick-ass score and more than competent camera work. But as far as the Lovecraftian inspirations, this one deviates just a little bit too much from the foundation. Instead, the Apocalypse Trilogy film that I'll be showcasing is In the Mouth of Madness, starring everyone's favorite, Sam Neill. After an illustrious and now elusive writer's newest novel is causing readers to go mad beyond sanity, leading to murders and riots, a freelance insurance investigator is hired to find out where Sutter Kane has disappeared to in order to get to the bottom of what's happening. Believing everything to be one big publicity stunt, the investigator will need a lot more to convince him as his journey leads him to a strange village where even stranger things have been happening. And at the center of it all are the writings of Sutter Kane. In the Mouth of Madness, to me, feels like one giant love letter to Lovecraft. Hobbs End, if you knew, you knew, serving as the place where all of Kane's work takes place, the mishmash of Shadow over Innsmouth and At the Mountains of Madness, Innsmouth of Madness, In the Mouth of Madness. It starts off with our main character in a mental hospital like The Thing on the Doorstep, and even a cult-like group forming after being exposed to the works of a writer who is at the forefront of the cosmic horror, bringing unearthly monstrosities to the real world. On the surface, Sutter Kane might remind you of Stephen King, but it's impossible not to liken him to H.P. Lovecraft, given his subject material and direct allusion to the old ones, that regrettably are actually shown in the film. It also manages to set itself apart from other Lovecraft adaptations and cosmic films in general, as it actually shows us the aftermath of the apocalypse. More on the level of Village of the Damned and vampires than it is They Live or Big Trouble, In the Mouth of Madness is still one hell of a ride from beginning to end, supported wonderfully by a batshit performance by the great Sam Neill, and of course Carpenter's knack for catchy scores, as it opens with intrigue, starts off the narrative with the odd, leading to the uncanny, and then plunging us into a greater surrounding threat by the end. So yeah, John Carpenter, personally my favorite of the big 80s horror directors, has made several monumental movies that top the list of the best horror and sci-fi horror out there, and the Lovecraftian influence can be found within some of his best work.
Tier 3. When I initially started attempting and failing to organize this massive list of films, I couldn't believe how many fit the blood and gore category, and I do agree a couple were a bit of a stretch. But quite a lot of Lovecraft's works include the loss of bodily autonomy, as well as copious amounts of text dedicated to depicting the unimaginable to the reader. So it makes sense in a way that gory body horror and Lovecraftian cosmic horror would make such a nice blend. And it seems that a lot of people got the memo. It has been one hell of a long journey getting to this point, but we're not quite done yet. There are definitely some films that you've been waiting to see mentioned, so let's put a cap on this video with my entirely subjective top 10 list that's less about the actual top 10 Lovecraftian films and is more just a vehicle for the ones that I really enjoy talking about. Starting off with Absentia. 7 years after the disappearance of her husband, a woman finally musters up the courage to claim him dead in absentia in order to move on with her life. She reconnects with her younger sister and starts a blooming relationship with one of the detectives that was working on the case, who has been helping her along the way, when abruptly, her husband reappears and won't tell anybody about what happened, showing an inexplicable fear for the strange tunnel in their neighborhood. Aside from your typical faults in independent films, blown out highlights, a lot of blank walls, and wonky compositions, as well as stilted chemistry between actors until it becomes more believable later on in the production, Absentia is an immaculate first outing by Mike Flanagan, featuring an airy soundscape scoring this slow burn psychological thriller that deals with several interpersonal and internal conflicts, some frequently visited, and some that aren't often enough. Absentia, to me, is his best film, followed sort of closely by Hush for its unique premise, as well as that one episode of Hill House. And then everything else he's done falls under like a C- or below for me. I like a lot of what he's doing, but the films themselves just don't do it for me. Absentia, however, is completely different. The core of the story is what really drives it for me, that being dealing with a missing or presumed to be dead loved one. I really enjoy movies that deal with this sort of thing. Someone lost, but there's no body or confirmation. Are they alive or not? The whole not knowing, and how do you move forward after something like that? It's not often that movies do center on a story like this, and twisting it into Lovecraftian territory with the mysterious creature in the tunnel, potential parallel dimensions, a bit of historical play, and a lot of answers that just bring up more questions is very fitting, and it works very well here. Altered states. In a bid to cure or understand schizophrenia better, a scientist working with the theory that schizophrenia is just another state of consciousness hears of shared hallucinations among the Henshi tribe, and he visits them in order to investigate. What he finds sets him on the path to the unsightly answers that he seeks. So when I was talking about experimental filmmaking, this is a great example of what I was talking about. Holy shit, this film is a trip. Such a trip that when I initially tried watching the film back about 10 years ago now, I watched it 4 times in the span of a year because I kept forgetting that I had watched it. It'd get to a certain point in the middle of the film where it'd all click and then I'd just keep watching anyways, because obviously it's just a great film. Directed by Ken Russell, I still need to see The Devils, and bolstering an amazing performance from William Hurt in his first film role? The fuck? As essentially a neurodivergent coded man, just absolutely obsessed with alternate states of being and the true self. His obsessive enthusiasm is infectious and keeps us dialed in the whole time. But the rest of the cast is stacked as well. And the film being written by Patty Chayefsky, it's just straight up a powerhouse of talent. And the fact that it's so weird and yet manages to still be a great film is perfection. And on top of that, it's pretty damn Lovecraftian to boot. Cells containing billions of years of information, regression and devolution, the origin of life, another state of understanding, becoming even one with the universe with a phenomenal depiction of what that may look like. All these things wrapped around a tender, lost connection between 2 life partners that elevates the themes of the film beyond just the cosmic and injects heart into a very heavy discussion. It's also sporting some great VFX for the time, and even holding up today in my opinion, as it still does a good job of conveying what it needs to. I want to take a moment to really hammer home just how beautiful this film is. Even the normal shots are amazing, but for me it's the montage scenes that have some of the most impactful and immaculate shots. I especially love this shot of the bodies of the main character and his wife, turning to sand. and being blown away little by little. Every time I watch this film, I'm just left in awe.
There's not much more to say. It's a great film that when people say, like an acid trip, this is the movie that my brain jumps to. Although it is one of those you either love it or hate it films. I can definitely see it being overbearing and too wordy, or attempting to be more than the sum of its parts for some people, but not for me. Panos Cosmatos has a bit of Lovecraft in everything he's done so far. Beyond the Black Rainbow has culty behavior, a new breed of humanity and psychic powers, as well as an experimental drug that forces open the consciousness into new realms of understanding, with his Kubrick and Cronenberg influence clashing as well with Ken Russell, creating something entirely his own and visually distinct. His segment in Del Toro's Cabinet of Curiosities, The Viewing, unmistakably Panos's in visuals and atmosphere, features an eldritch artifact collected by the collector to end all collections, who invites people to a special viewing, and as they peer at it, they consequently have their faces literally melted the fuck off by whatever it is that they see. Also, while we're on the subject, Cabinet of Curiosity has 2 Lovecraft adaptations, but there's actually a few other in the series that are Lovecraftian, Graveyard Rats, something like that, and then The Autopsy. Both of those are really Lovecraftian stories, one of which was directed by David Pryor. We'll be getting to that. But the film of his that I want to discuss is the balls to the wall Mandy. Red and Mandy live in the gorgeous mountains of the Pacific Northwest, where Red works as a lumberjack and Mandy works as a store clerk, both of them having escaped their troubled and traumatic past together as they now live peacefully, content in the quiet of the forest that they've carved out for themselves. When Mandy catches the eye of the leader of a new agey cult, who can't get her out of his head. The cult leader and his followers, employing the help of a demonic biker gang, descend upon Red and Mandy's house in an attempt to take her. This is a full-on Nicolas Cage Renaissance film, featuring not only great acting from him, but also his great wackadoo acting fervor made famous in films like Face Off. It's in my opinion currently Panos' best. It's like you take his feature-length debut, Beyond the Black Rainbow, and all of the unique things that it was doing, and you just kind of hone it down into a much sleeker and much more accessible package, and it's just amazing. The way Cosmatos works with color is just beautiful to me. Even in normal scenes, the way that things look just appear so otherworldly and fantastical. As someone who obviously cares a lot about the cinematography and grading side of filmmaking, Panos' films will always just be straight up my alley. They're some of the most striking and breathtaking images I've ever seen committed to film, wonderfully composed with grades that really push the color in ways that are so infrequently seen that you can't help but commit it to memory at the sheer sight of it. I could go on forever about how gorgeous these films are.
And the Lovecraft aspect, because I was sidetracked talking about the damn color, is also present. Here with the cult, but mainly the psychotrip drugs opening up the mind's eye to the greater expanses of the universe, and of course masterfully supplemented with the otherworldly feel of the film.
But the core of Mandy's story is very simple and easy to grasp. It's a revenge story, for the most part. And that allows the film to take its time and devote so much of it to the feel of the film over explaining things to us. But don't let the simplicity fool you. This movie gets really wild. Demon bikers hopped up on satanic acid, hippie freak Charles Manson types that don't take rejection too well, and a mentally unhinged and physically domineering Nicolas Cage at the center of it all, just devouring scenery and loving it. Possession. A man returns home from an overly long spy job to his wife demanding a divorce and full custody of their child, Bob. His wife swears that she hasn't been involved with another man, but one day he receives a phone call from a man claiming the opposite. While picking up Bob from school, he meets his teacher, who looks exactly like his wife. After several altercations increasing in violence with his wife and her lover, he hires an investigator to tail her, as the story spirals out of control and into stranger territory. This is the main film that I was thinking about when I said that there's a few of my own personal picks that are only really borderline Lovecraftian. But I really wanted to talk about this one, as it's such a great film that was very important for me for a while. There come certain milestones in watching horror, or even just film in general, where you have your eyes open to something completely new or different, or just
life-altering. In my case, Possession was a huge deal for me, as it was such a weird film with weird acting and weird choices, but I couldn't at first figure out why it enamored me so. So I rewatched it a few times and never really came to a conclusion, realizing that there are just some films that get you, that might be hard to recommend for just how weird they are. Possession is a film about, well, possession. Specifically in the, for lack of a better word, owning of someone or something from someone. In this case being the love of a partner, and specifically how that love can change and how we can build up idealized version of people who might not really be those people anymore. More directly, the film deals with the inner turmoil of a relationship and the conflict between love and hate for the same being. Sure, there's a weird tentacle creature that shows up about halfway through, but that's not really the Lovecraftian part of it that I'm wanting to hammer home. But it definitely doesn't hurt. Combined with the overall atmosphere of the film, it's the isolation you can feel in a doomed or spiraling relationship, the struggle of it all. A sort of the thing on the doorstep looking into the eyes of someone you love and seeing someone else entirely. That's a very scary and real scenario. It's a very heavy film that expresses itself so uniquely with images that burn themselves into your mind with extremity and unease. I can't help but love this film. It's very surrealist, where quite literally nothing ever feels right, especially in its decisions to break rules and conventions and when to do so. Seemingly filmed almost entirely in purposeful masters, with very long scenes and minimal cuts that feel as though the director just started rolling and let the actors just go at each other's throats. Speaking of, the extremely extra acting out of everyone involved is just top-notch. Sam Neill and Isabel Adjani knock it out of the park, performing in a way that feels inhuman, but at the same time like personifications of intense emotions. Like I said, this film is very weird, but every time I watch it, I find myself being enthralled by its thick, intense atmosphere of paranoia and mystery, being shown some of the most extremely uncomfortable things, yet captivated entirely, and unable to look away. Resolution and the Endless. This last entry for the first half of the top 10 is indeed a cop-out 2-for double feature of 2 films from Aaron Moorhead and Justin Benson. But real quick, given the nature of these videos, I don't devote more than 2 to 3 minutes to discuss each film, and given the surface skimming nature of each film's section, I stray as far away from true spoilers as much as possible. So those of you who know will know I'm being a little bit vague with this. But I would like to stress the importance of watching Resolution first, and then following that up with The Endless. Although they do work individually as their own films, I feel that they really do work well as companion pieces. It's like poetry. They rhyme. Now, on to the movies. A man travels out into the sticks where his lifelong friend has spiraled out of control on a drug binge while squatting in an unfinished shack with a stray dog. He ties him to the piping and gives him an ultimatum, as he extends one final lifeline for his friend before cutting him out of his life completely. As the days go by, a mystery pops up concerning found photographs near a cave, as well as photographs and recordings appearing of the 2 men that couldn't have been taken by anyone. This is one of the most interesting and extraordinary films I've ever seen, starting out with a ton of heart and comedy with the banter and chemistry between the 2 leads.
I'm gonna fire up some chili, you want some?
So got crack in it, motherfucker?
But taking the story in such a strange direction when the odd stuff starts happening, that while feeling close to what some other films have done in the past and since, feels completely fresh here, and done in such a way that leaves you hungering for more like it. It's also filmed with a sort of shakiness and matter-of-factedness that is reminiscent of found footage, with some seemingly out-of-place burn transitions that at first glance were all just visual flair, but they actually get wonderfully tied into the plot of the film itself. The cosmic aspects of the film aren't very evident at the beginning. It sort of lulls you into different expectations and then starts to drip feed the Lovecraftian elements over time. A sense of impending threats, weird time wonkiness, and an unseen entity, seemingly having an effect on the area surrounding the crack shack, whose goals or motivations remain unclear. It's one of those films that I can gush about for a long time, but I have to move on to the next film, The Endless. 2 brothers, after getting a package containing a video from the Doomsday Cult that they escaped together, find out that their friends are all still alive. The brothers, both of them having different opinions and memories of the cult, decide to meet in the middle and make a quick trip to check in before heading back out. When they arrive, they find that no one has really aged, that the deity in the forest might be more real than they thought, and that the commune's ascension is about to occur, making it more difficult to leave than they had imagined. as tensions arise between the brothers. Both of the directors, Justin and Aaron, play the leads in this film, and it would be an absolute shock to me if they weren't close in real life. Not only because they have such an intertwined and great career together, but the chemistry on display in this film and their recent film, Something in the Dirt, which also has cosmic vibes, is very believable. They truthfully feel like brothers in this film.
It's possible.
One brother managing while still having to work for it to integrate into society, while the other brother is struggling, to say the least. One over-exaggerates the experiences they had, while the other only remembers the good familial atmosphere that he was brought up in. It's great to see unfold, and again, is a great dynamic to play with. Aaron, who, while co-directing, is also the camera operator, just abso-fucking-lutely has my number when it comes to cinematography. Like on display and resolution, there is also a very in-the-moment feel to the camera work in almost all of their films. It's realistic camera movements with an entirely non-diegetic camera that really integrate you into what's going on as an observer, and I just always dig the fuck out of it. I'm sure you're tired of hearing me harken back towards found footage, so I tried to spice that up a bit. It can also get pretty meta fourth wall breaky, and that's super interesting as well. Opening with a quote from the man himself, this film is very upfront with its Lovecraftian inspirations. If the giant invisible sky god cults and the multiple afoot mysteries didn't clue you into it enough. Speaking of the invisible sky god, it's actually a great depiction of a Lovecraftian entity, as it never shows up on film, and instead heavily implies its presence, and at times its point of view. Not only being a wonderful addition to the film itself, but it also means I didn't have to talk about fucking Bird Box in this video. Apologies if you were waiting on that, by the way. Ever since I saw these films, and really their entire catalog, I've been hooked on them, and I can't wait to see what else Justin and Aaron bring us in the future. Again, I absolutely recommend taking the time to sit down with both of these films back to back, as it's a really cool experience that I think everyone should get the chance to have. Moving on. Stalker. After a nuclear reactor melts down, the surrounding area gets closed off and quarantined from the public. Curious people who want to enter this area, a writer looking for inspiration, and a professor looking for answers, hire a man known as a stalker, who will help them to safely traverse the dangerous zone. Finally arriving, the group begins their arduous trek to their destination, a place known only as the Room, that is said to grant the deepest desires of anyone who enters. Tarkovsky's other film, Solaris, which is his response to Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey, is also pretty cosmic, obviously being science fiction by nature and dealing with topics of the unknown, both on a large and a personal scale. 2001 itself, cosmic in a way, dealing with something beyond our time and understanding, influencing our evolution, as well as universal revelations. But both it and Solaris are sort of teetering on the line of Lovecraftian, both being their own thing. Therefore, I'm focusing more on Stalker, which is more directly cosmic in my opinion. The zone is on the surface an exclusion zone that is heavily guarded by the military after a nuclear power plant meltdown. But it takes on a whole new life once we're inside. Combined with the contrast of sepia tone outside and full color inside, it appears like a completely different world. Its physics are even all wonky, with weird strict rules in place for traversing its fields, as well as being filled with radiation that has a long-lasting effect on the stalkers who frequent it. The Room is an anomaly that grants the deepest desires of the person who enters, and it brings with it the discussion of what someone really wants. You can say all that you want, that world peace or an end to world hunger is what you desire. But is it really? Can we really ever know ourselves like that? As someone who's a very big environmentalist coming from the mountains, as every 2 years or so there's a giant chunk of forest ripped from the soil in order to place another Kroger that's 2 minutes closer than the other one, I can't ignore the parallels within Stalker that bring up the topic of humans as a disease. Outside, the world is wrought with decay and pollution brought on by excessive industrialism. Meanwhile, inside the zone, lacking noticeably in human interference, it is filled with vibrant life and lush landscapes, showing a world that is healing and returning back to how it once was, how it should be. There's also the little fact that the Stalker's daughter, noted as having mutations as a result from his extensive stays in the zone, is also always shot in color. There are a bunch of ways to interpret the film, but the way that's always stuck with me is the topic of faith and beliefs, where each character represents one part of my favorite triangle: a believer, a skeptic, and a skeptical believer. One wanting to believe, one wanting to analyze, and our guide, the stalker, already knowing, acts as a sort of guide to the truth, but never partakes in it himself. But my viewing of it obviously isn't pro-faith. To me, it reads more as pro-humanity. Like we're all stuck in this world together, whether we like it or not, unable to make a difference in the grand scheme of things, but what brings light to the world is our interpersonal connections and the company we keep. Essentially, we make and foster our own light. In other words, life is what we make of it. Stalker is an incredibly thoughtful and poetic film, which of course means it's not for everyone, and I get that, I do. But it's comprised of the most beautiful compositions and camera work, as well as an introspective and hypnotic story as we get closer and closer to the room and what it has to say about humanity, both its inherent faults and chosen strengths, filled with tons of musings on the state of the world from a very cynical point of view, but hopeful in that by reflecting on the issues, we can work to understand each other and move forward together. As it turns out, a bit too hopeful, I guess. Every move of the camera and every line of dialogue is purposefully chosen and articulated. The average shot duration is over a minute long in this already pretty long film. Combined with the locations and setting, the masterful compositions, and the dreamlike, blissful score and sound design, it's no wonder that this film just works for me, and is permanently cemented as my go-to default answer for what my favorite film of all time is. Saying nothing really happens isn't really untrue, but during the entire almost 3-hour duration of the film, you can't look away. Captivated by its gorgeous sights and trance-inducing sounds, as well as the dynamics between the group. It's a masterpiece with a ton of cosmic overtones that I couldn't help but bring up here. The Empty Man. A group of hikers are climbing a mountain when one of their friends follows a weird woodwind sound and falls into a pit. They rappel down to retrieve him, finding him captivated and staring at a strange skeleton, seated in a praying position. A storm brews while they bring him to an abandoned house nearby, and the friend group begin to have hallucinations of a cloaked figure as they all go mad in a matter of days. This is just the beginning of the film, as we cut to the modern day with ex-detective, current army supply store owner James La Sombra, word to my Spanish-speaking audience, who has been called on by a friend to investigate the disappearance of her daughter. He finds that she was involved with a game inspired by local legend that involves blowing into bottles on a bridge while invoking a figure known as the Empty Man. As La Sombra continues to dig, the sheer scale of what's going on grows larger and more personal. The first time I watched this film, I was more along the lines of thinking that everything going on was just a tulpa, and still found the film to be phenomenal with its detective thriller premise and droppings of horror. But revisiting the film after reading a bunch of Lovecraft only served to heighten it in my eyes. I'm not going to spoil anything, but in the Cthulhu mythos, there exists a certain entity, Nyarlathotep, a shapeshifter that presents itself as a human while doing his dastardly deeds, dealing in chaos and insanity. Not to mention the film also has the inclusion of the typical Lovecraft fare, cults, and madness. Directed by David Pryor, who also directed the Lovecraftian short film AM 1200 discussed earlier, in his feature debut decided to grace us with a wonderful short film at the start of the film. Honestly, if that portion was cut and trimmed and shipped off to festivals, I'm pretty sure he'd walk away with at least a couple awards. I love that instead of a cold open that shows up, spends about 5 minutes on it, and then scoots on over to the main story, we actually got to spend a lot of time here. The mystery and the intrigue built that won't get revealed until much later when all the pieces start to fit together, as well as the atmosphere and tone getting established, makes it a very captivating start to the film. If I had to change one thing about this film, other than the marketing of course, it would be the runtime. It's 2 hours and 15 minutes as it stands, but if I'm being honest, it feels more like a $1.45 kind of story to me. Even keeping the intro at 22 minutes, which is pretty well paced if even a bit fast, what remains of the story really does drag at times. I personally would have cut certain hallucination scenes, specifically coming from La Sombra, and maybe trimmed down a few deaths. But that's just me. I'm fine with it personally, but everybody that I've shown the film to, upon its completion, says the same thing. Damn. That was a long film, but back to my other complaint real quick, the marketing. I get that the Empty Man in the universe of the film makes sense thematically and all that, not really griping about the entity being called that, but the choice to name the film The Empty Man grossly misled audiences. It makes you think of The Bye-Bye Man.
Even before that film came out and shat the bed as hard as it did, no one wanted to see that. It sounds stupid. So studio execs or someone with final say looked at this film and said, "Oh yeah, sure, that works. Thanks, guys." Nevertheless, the film still sits in the top 5 of the top 10 here for a good reason. Not because it's the objectively best film, that's not what this is all about. It's just that I enjoyed it so much. As mentioned, there are tons of lingering shots, and a heavy emphasis put on building atmosphere, all with a character sitting at the center of an enigmatic case that he's unraveling that just gets wilder and wilder, until we reach a wonderful climax that unlocks all the doors we didn't even know were in the hall that we just traversed. And I just dig the fuck out of it. Stephen King is no stranger to Lovecraftian inspirations, as we've discussed with his frequently associated The Mist in Tier 3. But that's not the story of his that I feel has the most cosmic horror. That would actually be one of the first films I ever watched, as well as just a severely guilty pleasure of mine, It. On a stormy evening in Derry, Maine, a young girl is murdered right outside of her home. Local librarian and bachelor Mike Hanlon, recognizing the events, calls all of his friends, affectionately self-ascribed the Losers Club, who all left Maine to live successful lives, in order to tell them that it has returned, and that it's time to adhere to the promise they made. Bill, now a successful horror writer pissed at shitty adaptations of his work, Clever, has a flashback of a rainy day where his little brother George went outside to play and never came back home. We follow the two storylines as in the past the kids uncover the mystery of who was committing the murders and why none of the adults seem to notice, and in the present as the kids return as adults to put an end to it all. Confession. I've owned a copy of Stephen King's It for about 8 years now, and I haven't made it past chapter 1. It's something that when I plan to go into a video solely for It, I do plan to tackle. From what I've read so far, I can already feel that it would be way more up my alley than the adaptations have been. It opens with some very heavy-handed discussions on backwood town racism and homophobia, and that's what I like so much about Pennywise, is his parallel to the town and what he really represents, the ugly underbelly of history. With this film, there's sadly not a lot for my technical side to chew on. Given the budget and TV format, it's more charm than anything. The fades to black because commercials, one of which is used at a pretty hilarious moment. The score feels cheesy at times, and the editing choices are, I'm assuming, accidentally funny. But all of this just adds to the fun of the film for me. It's not going to win any Oscars, but nobody actually cares about that shit. It also helps that they chose really good child actors for the past. Something that is usually getting excused when discussing films is actually one of this film's strongest suits, combined with how well King writes groups of kids. And as outcasts, they must band together and overcome this presence as they discover it's more otherworldly than they could have imagined. The willful ignorance of the adults here really adds to the isolation and mystery as well. It's like they're complacent in what's going on, or they just want so bad to ignore the history and bad elements of the town. It really adds such an interesting aspect and puts something very Lovecraftian at the forefront. Of course, Pennywise is an alien entity. Spoilers. Sorry. But there's also something better. While reading Pickman's model, in relation to this film, I couldn't help but think of one thing that Pickman had said. Don't you realize that places like that weren't merely made, but actually grew? Generation after generation lived and felt and died there. It's giving life to a location in a way that perfectly resonates with it. Pennywise is the representation of this life, a history, dark, that the adults both understand and willfully ignore, going on about their lives while something evil festers underneath the surface. This is the part of it that I completely latched onto, that combined with the aforementioned cosmic crab thing, I feel it's the most Lovecraftian of King's works that have been adapted to the screen, and it's something that I'd love to see expanded on properly if we ever get another remake. I'm available whenever. Just a thought. I think that's enough talking about this film, because I do need to save some stuff for the actual video on it. It's one of my favorite movies, both as a guilty pleasure and as just a fun movie to throw on.
You do? Well, you better let the poor guy out!
I really need to finish that book. Cure. Several grisly murders occurring in Japan are left with a strange X pattern slashed into the bodies of the victims, and although they're all committed by different people who are apprehended and confess shortly after, this leads police to believe there is something connecting them as Detective Takabe investigates. The case weighs on him heavily as at home his wife suffers from mental instability, frequently getting lost in the neighborhood and needing assistance from her husband. Eventually, Takabe and his partner narrow it down to one man being the link between all of the murders, and they bring him into custody for questioning. The suspect claims to have memory loss, not knowing anything about himself whatsoever, as his curiosity and fascination for Detective Takabe grows. This is a very slow and mood-filled film that seldom features actual scares, instead concentrating on the dread and mystery surrounding the murders and the source influencing them and why. When I think of good horror cinematography, this is one of the films that truly nails it. Such a matter-of-fact way of displaying things that actively pushes away the new norm of jumpy and flashy editing, that it really solidifies its world as real. It's something that stands out to differentiate it in a refreshing way with thoughtful compositions and prolonged frames. The sound design, also being very understated with mostly diegetic sounds, serves to boost the atmosphere. Combined with the long shots and editing, it really sells the tone of the film, the unease and the lurking fear of the unknown. Funnily enough, building along the way a very hypnotic and alluring audiovisual motif. At the beginning of the film, the Lovecraftian elements are very subdued, but as we progress, the cosmic horror becomes unavoidable. As we delve into a world of revelations too heavy to handle, thought suggestion influencing people to murder, and at the center of it all, a puzzling man who can't remember his own name. Going much further into the details would be spoiler territory, so I'll just say this is a prime example of the subtler aspects of cosmic horrors, specifically the dread of impending doom and loss of control over one's own body or actions, as people give in to those Call of the Void style thoughts. Cure's director, Kiyoshi Kurosawa, actually has another film that fits the Lovecraftian bill that I wanted to mention real quick. If you've been interested in J-horror, then you're probably familiar with Pulse, and at the very least also know that it got a shitty American port that should be avoided at all costs. Pulse, the original, is another film that is filled to the brim with moody atmosphere and a thought plague that spreads rapidly, bringing with it themes of isolation and deep depression, confronting death and mortality. And my favorite, ghosts as a metaphor. It's a sad and very introspective film that has a lot to say about issues we face in the modern world, as we were meant to use technology to become more interconnected, but all it seemed to have done is further alienate us from one another. But back to Cure. The funnest part of the film, which I guess it'd be better just to say interesting, is the targets for the influence, as the people committing murder all state that they don't know why they did it, but throughout the film, during the mesmerism, we see our suspect Mamiya eking out a sort of confession, and sort of fanning the flames of the thoughts that we naturally have. It's not murder for the sake of murder. It's these people's desires, no matter how small. A world that has been built on these thoughts, resentments, and repressed feelings, whereas Mamiya, the suspect, represents the cure. How this all comes into play with Detective Takabe is just vastly intriguing to see unfold, as well as just think about, but I'm probably giving too much away. If you haven't seen the film, make it a high priority. It's commonly cited as one of the best horror films ever made, and for a damn good reason. Wonderfully made and carefully constructed, it's one of those films that muses on important and thought-provoking topics, and then finishes in just the right way that is truly astounding. And I love films like this that stick around for days after you finish them. And now, onto our final film, The Thing. Did you really think we weren't going to talk about it? At an American research base in Antarctica, the crew is disrupted when a Norwegian helicopter chases after a dog, ultimately crashing nearby.
The helicopter doesn't actually crash. This is actually what happens. I'll forgive the fumble, but you try to cover a grenade with snow? I mean, maybe you could argue that he was trying to find it so that he could toss it further away from the helicopter, but that's a weird technique. Anyways, they brandish, and Antarctica is a stand-your-ground continent, so...
The American group heads to their base to check in, finding a burnt-down facility, the bodies of their crew, and strange remains that they bring back for examination. At night, they stow the runaway dog with their sledders, as it begins to change. If someone asked me what my top 10 horror movies were, I'd tell them to stop putting stock into other people's subjective preferences and go watch more movies for themselves. But if I took the inquiry seriously, I'd know for a fact that The Thing would instantly be thrown into the pile of potential candidates. I am a notorious sucker for isolated settings, minimal casts, and I'm especially fond of well-done practical creature effects. So, no surprise, The Thing is one of my favorite films. It's even got a tinge of humor thrown in there too.
You gotta be fucking kidding.
Making for a wonderful balance of all the things that I enjoy from horror films. It's got an amazing cast featuring two of my favorite actors period, Kurt Russell and Keith David.
Who the fuck are you?
Well, how the hell did you get the beans above the frying? I mean,
And the score for the film is simple but effective at the absolute height of Carpenter's composing, in my opinion. But that's more because Halloween and The Thing cater to a theme that I much prefer. Here, Carpenter is working with Ennio Morricone, of all people, to conduct an ominous synth tone supporting the film, while Carpenter himself handled a lot of the drones. A lot of films in the modern age have to specifically set aside a portion of their script to explain and re-explain for the audience that, hey, there's no cell signal. This is something that just a lot of older film, I hate saying that about 80s films, this is something that a lot of older films just naturally had covered. Here, added on top of that cold isolation of the research facility, so far away from human civilization, makes for a very sheltered and closed-in atmosphere. The story here, being based both on the book Who Goes There and the original adaptation released in 1951, deviates enough to make it entirely its own thing. A smaller cast, more emphasis on the shape-shifting thing that's present in the book, and a lot of added-in fun for the special effects team to go crazy on, and go crazy they did. The creature effects here, painstakingly created in extremely stressful conditions by the legend Rob Bottin, and of course a bunch of helpers, are simultaneously some of the most inventive for the time as well as long-lasting on film in general. The Thing was shot by frequent Carpenter collaborator Dean Cundey, who was also a frequent collaborator for Robert Zemeckis and Steven Spielberg on some of their best films. Cundey just has the sauce when working with talented directors and helped bring some amazing films to life. Here, really emphasizing the lurking presence with tons of tracking shots and perfectly framing the exterior and interiors to get across just how confined and trapped the crew are. The Lovecraftian elements are loud and proud as the film opens up with the crash landing of a spaceship, then, after a long intense wait, we finally get our reveal as all hell breaks loose in the dog pen. And we see the enemy for what it is, shape-shifting in all of its grotesque glory, one might say beyond human comprehension. While it imitates the members, it's not just murdering them or aiming for world domination, it wants to make it out and get back home. It is working purely off of survival instinct. Another bit of the Lovecraftian is its ability to perfectly copy us also kind of dumbs us down to that of mere animals or plant life in the grand scheme of the cosmos, while showing how far ahead of us that the organism really is, further hammering home our insignificance. But also the fact that it is impersonating the crew leads to paranoia and distrust amongst the group as we get a healthy dose of the fear of the unknown, not knowing what they're up against or who has been turned. It looks good, it sounds good, and by fucking dog, it feels good. An all-around masterpiece in filmmaking that has stood the test of time and continues to deliver year after year through countless rewatches. It is phenomenal. So, why are we drawn to cosmic horror? There are actually a lot of reasons that jump out at me. Our undying need to understand the world and the paradox of knowledge. The more we learn about something, the more we understand that we don't know. Cosmic horror also addresses anxieties surrounding scientific exploration. As outlined in the opening of Call of Cthulhu, fearing that one day we may venture too far and attain knowledge that is too much for humanity to handle. It's also a subgenre that is just filled with tons of anxiety surrounding our general lack of control in the grand scheme of life. And of course, fear of the unknown is a great building block to an antagonistic force, especially when it comes to horror. But the one that really resonates, at least for me, is that we fear death. Not just death itself, but what it ultimately means. Ceasing to exist. Both from a spiritual perspective, but also literally. In 1,000 years, will anyone remember your name, what you did, or even the things that you enjoyed? It's a horror that reaches beyond the screen and heavily seeps into the real world. With a normal horror film, you may walk back to your car afterwards and look over your shoulder for an escaped lunatic or a creature stalking you, but cosmic horror lingers on the conscious like nothing else. When it comes to cosmic horror, the thing that draws me to it the most is the existentiality, that ultimately life is meaningless. Seeing the many different ways that can play out on screen has and will continue to be fascinating to me, as it opens so many different avenues for personal flair and interpretation, where filmmakers can pick and choose and branch off in any which way that they want, creating such a wide array of interpretations and just cool films. This has been one long project, and it's finally over. We have covered so many films, from the adaptations of Lovecraft's work in short films, found footage, sci-fi, thrillers, romance, all the way up to extreme horror. And I even carved out a little section for my top 10 where I got to discuss some of my favorite films. So, I want to know, what cosmic horror film is your favorite, and why? Is there a deep personal thread connecting you to it? Or is it just a cool film? Let me know in the comments. I hope you've enjoyed, and most importantly, thank you for watching. One of my favorite things about cosmic and Lovecraftian horrors is just how versatile it can be. It's really one of its biggest strengths. It's turned into one giant group project where everyone can have their own spin and take on what makes the universe tick. Lovecraft, as a generalization, took the meaninglessness of life as its own horror. But I look at it as a bonus. It's such a random accident that we exist, and we shouldn't for a moment take that for granted. I find myself specifically drawn to stories not of absolute cosmic horror, but ones that include cosmic bliss. Those films that take the ultimately uncaring universe and overall meaningless existence of humanity and shines a glimmer down from above, telling us that it's okay. So it's important sometimes to remember to take a break from the crushing weight of reality. Make someone laugh. Pay something forward. Hug your pets. And most of all, enjoy some great movies and share them with people. I've been Hound. Later.